Hello there, and welcome to this quiet corner where we let our thoughts drift and the world slows down just enough for curiosity to breathe. Tonight, we're going to step into a question both enormous and gentle. What if all ice melted? Not a glacier here or there, but every frozen crest, every polar cap, every mountain crown of snow vanished. Imagine a world suddenly remade, oceans creeping inland, rivers swelling into continents, and the air carrying a weight both humid and strange. Picture yourself standing where the poles used to hold their icy dominion. The wind smells differently now, heavier with salt, carrying a sense of things rearranged. Skies stretch wider, the horizon unrecognizable. The earth hums in a slower rhythm, and you can almost hear it breathe under the floodwaters. What would life do if suddenly every frozen place became water? Where would humans live? What creatures would thrive? And what landscapes would disappear without a sound? Maybe you're listening late, the lights low, the hum of a fan comforting beside you. Maybe it's the quiet before sleep, and you feel the strange intimacy of imagining the world so utterly transformed while sitting in the comfort of your own room. Leave a comment if you like, tell me what time it is and where you are. I'd love to know who's floating with me on this slow, water-rising journey. And so, before we see what a world without ice became, we need to start with the beginning, the ice itself, where it came from, how it shaped continents, and what happens when it lets go. Because tonight, we drift, not just through geography, but through time and imagination, letting the Earth's slow pulse guide us into the story. Imagine standing at the edge of the northern ice sheet. The wind is sharp, carrying a cold so clean it almost tastes like metal. Underfoot, the snow crunches with ancient memory, and the ice stretches farther than you can see, shaping everything, rivers, mountains, and the animals that dared to live here. Let's talk about the ice, how it blankets the land like a duvet pulled too tight, smooth and unyielding, yet alive with tiny fissures that whisper secrets older than your favorite bedtime story. You notice how the horizon seems to lean forward, urging your eyes to follow a frozen curve that might circle the planet twice, if it could, or if you had a spaceship handy. The air bites lightly at your cheeks, a cold that smells like iron filings and old library books, somehow both sharp and dusty at once. Boots on snow, skies aglow, shadows stretch where the cold winds blow. You might imagine this world as a minimalist art installation built by a giant penguin obsessed with symmetry, yet somehow it all feels perfectly natural. Each step you take sends soft echoes bouncing across the ice, a whispering chorus of frozen mountains, like the earth is softly rehearsing its own lullaby. The ice itself is a mosaic of textures, glassy sheets that reflect the sun in blinding brilliance, jagged ridges like teeth, and soft drifts shaped by wind into delicate crystalline dunes. The silence here is profound, but not empty. It hums with memory, the subtle creak of glaciers shifting, the distant groan of ice cracking under its own weight, like a world sighing after a very long nap. Snowflakes swirl lazily in the light, each one a tiny, transient cathedral of geometry, dancing as if auditioning for a celestial ballet. Frost clings to your eyelashes, a delicate filigree that glitters with every blink, and you feel suddenly as if the planet itself is giving you a wink, conspiring to lull you into slow attention. Icicles hang from cliffs like chandeliers in an abandoned palace, refracting sunlight into rainbows so faint they almost tease your vision. Icebergs float in frozen rivers, sculpted by winds and water alike, resembling abstract modernist sculptures that a very confused museum curator might hang upside down. The cold isn't just a sensation, it's a narrative, an invisible storyteller pressing its finger to your temple, suggesting that time here moves differently, more deliberate, more polite than the rush of a city sidewalk. Snowdrifts pile high, curling over themselves, like a cat deciding whether it wants to nap or chase a shadow. Clouds hang low, pale grey and heavy, promising snow that will add another layer to the endless blanket, another page to the diary of frozen time. The ice has a smell too, faintly sweet, like peppermint mixed with a whisper of ozone, and you wonder if the earth is trying to lull you into dreaming while it continues its silent work. Caves form under ridges, dark hollows that beckon with the promise of secrets, hidden pools of meltwater, ancient fossils, or perhaps nothing at all. The thought is absurdly comforting. The ice hides as much as it reveals, offering both mystery and a strange sense of order. Wolves move in the distance, shadows gliding over the snow in smooth, deliberate arcs. Their breaths puff white clouds into the frigid air, reminding you that life persists here, resilient, quiet, and sometimes alarmingly coordinated. Boots on sand, light on land, shadows stretch like a painter's hand. You notice the fine granularity of snow underfoot, a texture almost like sugar, but colder, denser, and infinitely more patient. Each snowflake carries a story, a tiny crystal diary of temperature and wind, etched invisibly, waiting for you to walk by and disturb it. A lone fox pauses, head cocked, observing you with the curiosity of someone who has seen thousands of years pass without flinching. At the edge of the ice, you lean forward slightly, imagining the valleys below hidden under miles of frozen silence. The landscape seems to stretch simultaneously toward infinity and inward, like the memory of a dream you almost remember. Snow drifts curl in sculpted arcs, soft as powdered sugar, yet hard as the discipline of a disciplined universe. The world feels enormous, absurdly so, and yet intimate, as if the ice is holding you close, whispering that everything here has happened before and will happen again. Snowflakes on nose, ice under toes, mountains bend where the cold wind blows. You realize the blanket isn't just covering the land, it is shaping it. A sculptor that works in patience, in millennia, in quiet persistence. Life has adapted, grown, and survived in the folds of this frozen sheet. The ice remembers everything and forgets selectively, a perfect combination of memory and mystery. And as you stand here, toes tingling, lungs tasting metal and peppermint, the snow crunching softly underfoot, you feel a rhythm, a heartbeat of the earth itself, slow, patient, and insistently enduring. Picture rivers that never run, frozen midstream, glittering under a pale Sunday. Water that should have moved is trapped, stacked in layers upon layers. And yet, beneath this stillness, life waits. Poised for the day, the ice loosens its grip. Let's walk closer, careful not to crack the delicate surface beneath your boots, as if the river itself were holding its breath, waiting for you to notice. The ice is smooth, yet jagged in places, sculpted by winds that seem to understand geometry better than any human architect. You can almost hear the frozen water humming quietly, a deep, resonant vibration that hints at energy trapped, but patient, waiting for its eventual release. The sunlight glances off the ice, like 1,000 tiny mirrors, reflecting fragments of sky that feel impossibly far away. You bend to look closer, your gloved fingers hovering above the glassy surface. Underneath, shadows shift. A fish frozen mid-swim, a leaf captured like a fossil, patterns that suggest movement without motion. It is absurd to imagine that what appears utterly still is, in a different sense, alive with history. You might compare it to an unread library of novels, stacked and frozen, each page a moment in time, waiting for thaw and interpretation. The air smells faintly of wet stone, a river that would run but cannot, layered with the crisp scent of frost. If you tilt your head, you might hear the faintest crack, a tiny groan as the ice settles, echoing down the riverbed like a distant drum. It is both eerie and comforting. The world has paused, but not ended. Snow drifts along the banks, sharp-edged and glistening, resembling sugar dusted on a chocolate landscape, if chocolate landscapes were immense and deadly cold. Here, a frozen wave seems to curl mid-crest, a sculpture caught between motion and stillness, reminding you that ice can be as fluid as it is rigid. Look upstream, and you notice a series of ice dams, stacked like oversized Lego blocks, created by a very meticulous giant. Water trickles beneath them, invisible to the eye, whispering secrets to the rocks below. Tiny creatures persist in crevices, surviving in a world where movement above is suspended, but survival below is stubbornly relentless. Perhaps a family of insects or a lone salamander has learned patience that would put any human to shame. Every bubble trapped in the ice is a miniature capsule of air, a tiny universe paused in its own timeline, sparkling like glass beads spilled across a frozen sheet. Step to the riverbank, and you feel the crunch of frozen sediment beneath your boots. Each grain of sand carries a story. Perhaps a glacier brought it here, or maybe a windstorm from centuries ago. You lift a hand and trace the frozen currents, imagining them alive, swirling endlessly beneath your fingers, like ink in water frozen mid-splash. The pale sun warms your face just enough to remind you that heat exists beyond this suspended world, though it cannot yet reach the core of these rivers. Frost flowers bloom along the edges, intricate, crystalline patterns that curl like delicate calligraphy. They are absurdly beautiful, almost comically intricate, compared to the bare practicality of survival that governs the river's life. You wonder if, somewhere far upstream, water is dreaming of flowing, pooling, dancing over stones in a liquid rhythm it remembers but cannot touch. There is a quiet suspense here, like standing in a theatre where the show is paused, the actors frozen mid-scene, and yet you can feel the energy of the narrative about to resume. Birds circle overhead, cautious but curious, calling to one another with sounds muted by distance and the frozen expanse. Their reflections shimmer in the ice, fractured and multiplied, giving the illusion of a flock larger than life, a ballet choreographed by the river itself. Occasionally, a crack echoes across the surface, startling in its sharpness, yet strangely musical, like a piano key struck in an empty hall. Each fracture hints at impermanence, at the inevitability of thaw, yet it is gentle, never violent, a whisper rather than a shout. And beneath it all, life stirs. Microorganisms, trapped fish, hidden roots, and tiny mammals beneath the ice, all waiting for the slow pulse of the seasons to resume its natural rhythm. The frozen river is not lifeless. It is patient, a quiet testament to endurance. It teaches you a lesson in stillness, that movement is not always visible, that energy can be contained gracefully, and that waiting is itself an art. As you step back, you take in the river in its entirety, endless, paused, a frozen melody of glass and shadow. You sense that every frozen current is a promise, a secret message written in ice, waiting to be read in the thaw. And for a moment, you are part of this suspended world, a quiet observer of frozen history, understanding that rivers, even when locked in time, are never truly gone. Imagine mountains carved not just by wind or rain, but by glaciers advancing like slow armies, peaks sharpened, valleys hollowed. The ice presses relentlessly, shaping stone as though it were clay, leaving marks that will last millennia. Let's move closer. letting your eyes trace the contours of these colossal formations. Each ridge and crevice, a frozen memory of patience and pressure. The air here carries a different weight, crisp and biting, with hints of mineral dust and the faint metallic tang of rock scraped clean by ice. Every inhalation fills your lungs with the scent of history, of cold, of slow transformation that feels both eternal and absurdly meticulous, like the world itself is on a very precise yoga schedule. Beneath your boots, scree crunches and slides in small avalanches, miniature rehearsals of chaos. The glaciers have gouged the mountains into forms that resemble sculpted art installations created by a giant with a taste for dramatic effect. Valleys are carved deep, narrow, and impossibly straight in places, like someone measured them with a ruler only the earth could see. You might think the mountains resemble giant frozen sandwiches stacked haphazardly, yet they are elegant, deliberate, sculpted over tens of thousands of years, with a patience that would make the most disciplined librarian jealous. Sunlight catches on the peaks, illuminating facets of ice and stone in dazzling arrays, as if the mountains are wearing crowns of crystal. Shadows stretch down long slopes, shifting gently as the day moves, emphasizing the paradoxical stillness and motion of this frozen realm. Small rivers of meltwater trickle along ledges, their paths winding unpredictably, yet always purposeful, like caffeine-fueled scribbles on a notebook that secretly form a map. You bend slightly, letting the icy air graze your cheeks, feeling the bite of wind that is sharp enough to sting, but gentle enough to remind you that you are alive, present, and witnessing the slow artistry of glacial movement. Listen closely. You can hear a deep, resonant groan, a subtle symphony of stone yielding to ice. Occasionally, a crevasse whispers as it opens, a sound like a sigh from the planet itself, acknowledging your presence. You realize the mountains are storytellers, narrating a tale of immense patience, of pressure applied gradually, reshaping everything over epochs too vast for your mind to fully grasp. You step carefully across frozen ledges, the texture of ice underfoot alternating between smooth glass-like surfaces and jagged teeth of crystalline rock. The sensation is absurdly tactile, like walking across a piano keyboard made of glass shards, delicate, dangerous, and strangely mesmerizing. Eagles wheel high above, their shadows sweeping across snowfields, emphasizing the scale of these peaks. Occasionally, a rock dislodges and tumbles down, a slow-motion avalanche reminding you that even in stillness, the mountains are alive. Tiny plants cling to cracks in stone, mosses and lichens that somehow survive in this extreme environment, defying logic and expectation. They are like stubborn post-it notes stuck to the side of a skyscraper, insisting on leaving their mark against all odds. You pause to touch a ridge of ice, letting your fingers trace its smooth curve. Tiny bubbles are frozen inside, each one a miniature time capsule of air, climate, and precipitation from centuries past. You imagine holding one up to your eye and peering into a world that existed before humans walked these heights, before animals migrated across continents, before the earth learned patience on a scale incomprehensible. The ice has memory. It remembers pressure, temperature, storms, and silence, and it writes these histories into stone. From this vantage point, the surrounding peaks seem endless, folding into distant horizons like waves frozen mid-crash. The mountains have a rhythm, a subtle undulation that mirrors the slow pulse of glaciers creeping forward, reshaping valleys, nudging rivers into new paths, sculpting entire ecosystems without haste. Clouds swirl around summits, curling into shapes that seem almost deliberate, perhaps an abstract suggestion from the planet itself. a nod to the absurdity of grandeur on a scale humans can only dream about. Snowflakes catch in your hair, melting into droplets that trace cool paths down your neck. The contrast of warmth and cold, soft and hard, motion and stillness, leaves you suspended in a meditative observation of geological time. Each mountain, each ridge, each icy slope is a lesson in patience, a reminder that the Earth moves on a rhythm far slower than human life but profoundly more persistent. Finally, as you step back, you take in the panorama, glaciers gripping peaks like determined gardeners pruning stone, valleys carved deep as if to hold secret rivers, and shadows dancing gently across ice that will last for millennia. You feel both insignificant and intimately connected, a witness to the deliberate artistry of frozen forces, the quiet humor in shapes that resemble something familiar yet impossibly vast. And as you breathe, you realize that these mountains, shaped by ice and stone alike, are storytellers, teachers, and conspirators in a world that moves slowly enough for you to notice, if only you slow down enough to pay attention. Think of oceans pulled back, their floors exposed. Land bridges appear where water once ruled, creating pathways for animals and humans alike. The world feels connected in strange, impossible ways. A map rewritten by frost and pressure. Let's step carefully onto this newly revealed land, feeling the grainy texture of sediment beneath your boots, a mixture of sand, silt, and ancient shells that crunch like broken porcelain underfoot. The air smells faintly of brine and wet stone, carrying whispers of tides long vanished. It is a quiet, uncanny smell, like stepping into a library where every book has been dampened but still retains its story. The land stretches in impossibly long ribbons, narrow corridors of earth where oceans once surged. You might imagine them as nature's own hallways, designed for migrations of animals, humans, and perhaps even imaginary explorers with absurdly oversized backpacks. Tiny streams trickle along the ridges of the exposed seabed, glinting like serpentine mirrors under a sun softened by ice-reflected light. Cracks and ridges in the sand suggest currents frozen mid-motion, patterns that look like abstract art designed by a very patient and slightly whimsical ocean deity. Gulls wheel overhead, their calls strange in the stillness, echoing across a landscape that would normally be underwater. You notice the distant shimmer of salt flats, cracked and patterned like a geometric puzzle left unfinished. Occasionally, a puddle reflects the pale sky above, a miniature ocean within an ocean, teasing you with a taste of what once was. The retreating waters have left behind treasures too subtle to immediately notice. Pebbles polished smooth, barnacle clusters stubbornly clinging to former rocks, and driftwood snapped into impossible shapes. You might imagine them as ancient toys left behind by a giant sea child playing for millennia. Look down, and you see footprints frozen in silt, the faint impressions of animals long gone, or perhaps your own imagination projecting movement where none exists. You feel a quiet thrill imagining creatures walking these bridges, traveling from one continent to another, oblivious to human timelines. Ice still clings to distant mountains, casting long shadows over the land, reminding you that water may have retreated, but the grip of frost remains. Your breath curls in the cold air, forming tiny clouds that drift lazily before disappearing, a whisper of impermanence amid permanence. Salt crystals cling to rocks along the edges, sparkling like sugar crystals dumped by a careless baker, absurdly shiny against the drab grey of sediment. You might see the skeletal remains of a fish, pressed into mud, frozen in a quiet pose, like a forgotten actor waiting for its cue. The scale of it all is dizzying. The newly exposed seabed stretches farther than you can see, disappearing into hazy horizons. It feels as if the earth has paused, holding its breath while you wander across this liminal zone between ice and ocean. Listen closely. You can almost hear the faint, echoing slap of waves that are no longer there, replaced by silence, punctuated by the occasional rustle of wind-carved sand. Small creatures emerge, peeking from burrows and cracks, hesitant but eager to explore the new terrain. Insects, rodents, and even birds navigate this temporary landscape as if it were a floating carpet of possibility, adapting instantly to a world both familiar and utterly changed. The retreating water has created microhabitats, shallow pools, tidal depressions, and rocky outcrops, each a miniature theatre for life to continue, perform, and survive. If you tilt your head, you notice the outline of mountains reflected in the thin, residual pools of water, inverted like a surreal painting, reminding you that perception is as fluid as the water that once covered this land. The map of the world has shifted beneath your feet. Continents now touch in ways that would be impossible to navigate once tides return, creating absurdly direct pathways for species migration. You imagine mammoths, bison, and early humans following these corridors, stepping lightly as if on a carpet, guided by instinct, curiosity, and the quiet pulse of survival. The smell of brackish water rises as you approach larger pools, mingling with the earthy scent of wet clay. Tiny shells crunch underfoot, remnants of marine life now stranded, preserved like forgotten coins in a treasure chest. You bend down to touch the surface of a puddle, ripples forming and then freezing as the cold grips the shallow water, a reminder that the world moves in imperceptibly slow rhythms. You feel simultaneously vast and intimately connected, part of a story written in stone, ice, and water. Finally, as you step back, the panorama unfolds, land bridges stretching endlessly, rivers frozen in anticipation, sediment beds patterned with the fingerprints of former oceans. The retreating seas have revealed a planet remade, a labyrinth of possibility, and you are privileged to walk it, to feel the grainy earth under your boots, and to witness the quiet magic of a world reshaped by ice, gravity, and time. Here, the oceans are patient, and so are you, invited to observe the pause before the tide resumes, the frozen interlude in the symphony of Earth's long story. Envision woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant bison moving across a frozen stage. Their breath curls in the air, their fur thick against the cold. They are survivors of a planet at the mercy of ice, living lives in rhythm with the frozen world around them. Let's step quietly closer, careful not to disturb the subtle choreography of these creatures, as if the landscape itself has been rehearsing for this moment for millennia. The ground beneath your boots is hard and uneven, frozen sediment mixed with patches of snow that crunch softly with every careful step. It smells faintly of damp earth, animal musk, and a lingering hint of frost, a perfume no human artisan could replicate. The mammoths move like slow-moving fortresses, their curved tusks glinting in the pale Sunday. You notice the way their fur sways with each step, catching light like strands of fine copper wire. And you imagine that someone, somewhere, might mistake them for mobile sculptures in a post-apocalyptic gallery. Saber-toothed cats crouch low in sparse vegetation, muscles coiled, eyes sharp. Their movements are precise, measured, almost choreographed, as if they're auditioning for a silent Ice Age ballet. You can feel the rhythm of predator and prey, a pulse that beats slower than a heartbeat, but steadier than a glacier. Bison shuffle in tight herds, their heavy shoulders and thick coats a wall of warmth and motion. Each hoof strikes the frozen ground, leaving temporary imprints that the wind and snow will erase, like chalk drawings washed clean by winter rain. You notice the patterns of migration etched into the snow, tracks converging and diverging in an elegant, natural geometry. a roadmap of survival drawn across the continent. Even smaller animals, foxes and hares, dart among the giants, quick flashes of life against the muted palette of ice and stone. Occasionally, the frozen air carries the scent of distant predators, subtle and sharp, a reminder that life here is as dangerous as it is beautiful. You might imagine a fox sniffing your ankle, like an overly polite but intensely curious houseguest, considering whether you belong in this frozen theater. The wind whistles through the mountains and valleys, bending grasses and ice into strange, fluid shapes, giving the landscape a surreal, almost animated quality. Each creature moves in concert with this environment, adapting instinctively to cold, scarcity, and the unpredictable rhythm of the frozen world. The sunlight glints off icy ridges, casting long shadows across the plains. Each animal is outlined like a living silhouette in a minimalist painting, absurdly dramatic, yet perfectly suited to the scene. Woolly mammoths trumpet softly, the sound echoing across valleys, a voice both gentle and commanding. It carries a note of humor, as if these enormous beings are quietly mocking your attempts to understand their lives from the perspective of a fragile human body. You might imagine them gossiping about which herd member forgot to pack their own fur coat. Saber-toothed cats pause mid-step, tail flicking, muscles tensed, breathing puffs of air into the frozen ether. Their fangs, long and curved, catch faint sunlight, glimmering like polished ivory daggers left behind by a very meticulous jewelry maker, with no sense of scale. You can almost hear the rhythm of their hearts, syncing with the distant ice, a subtle, shared pulse that reminds you everything here, from predator to prey, is bound to the slow, patient tempo of the frozen land. The snow itself participates, swirled into soft drifts by the wind, masking tracks, creating new ones, constantly re-scripting the narrative of the beast's journey. Tiny flakes settle on fur, eyes, and tusks, highlighting contours and giving each creature a crown of frost. The contrast between massive, lumbering giants and delicate snowflakes is absurdly poetic, like watching a heavyweight ballet danced on a stage made entirely of glass. Evening approaches, and the sun dips low, casting everything in soft gold and silver. Shadows stretch longer, and the beasts begin to cluster near sheltered ridges, their movements slower, more deliberate. You watch a mammoth lower its head, tusks tracing arcs in the snow, creating ephemeral sculpture that will disappear with the next snowfall. A saber-toothed cat curls in a depression, its long tail wrapping neatly around its body, like a designer scarf meant for the apocalypse. You take a deep breath, inhaling the smell of fur, snow, and earth combined, feeling an almost conspiratorial intimacy with this ancient frozen world. You realize that life here persists not by conquering the cold, but by learning its rhythm, understanding its language, and moving in harmony with its immense patience. Every heartbeat, every breath, every careful step of the beasts is a testament to endurance, adaptation, and the quiet humor embedded in survival. Finally, you step back to take in the scene. A frozen stage populated by enormous, elegant, absurdly majestic creatures, each playing their part in a slow, timeless symphony of life. The cold bites gently at your cheeks, the wind whispers past your ears, and for a fleeting, profound moment, you are part of the rhythm observer and participant, human and ice, witnessing the poetry of survival on a stage shaped by frost, stone, and relentless patience. Now consider our ancestors, huddled by fire, crafting tools and stories. They do not see the Ice Age as extraordinary. It is just life. Yet their survival shapes the future, their choices carved into the frozen memory of the land. Let's approach quietly, observing without disturbing the delicate rhythms of their existence. The smoke curls from a small fire, twisting in spirals that catch the pale sunlight like calligraphy suspended in the cold air. The scent is smoky, earthy, and faintly sweet from burning resin, a comforting aroma that promises warmth amid frost-bitten winds. You notice how they wrap themselves in furs, heavy coats stitched from hides, fur catching the wind like a small, portable fortress against the cold. Each movement is deliberate, scraping stone, shaping spear points, or hollowing a bone to create tools for hunting, cooking, and survival. Your mind can't help but compare their meticulous work to someone assembling IKEA furniture without instructions, yet somehow producing objects of perfect functionality and elegance. Sparks fly occasionally as they strike flint, tiny stars igniting briefly before fading, each one a small, ephemeral celebration of ingenuity. You can almost hear the soft murmur of conversation, laughter, and murmured stories carried on the frigid wind, a soundtrack to an ordinary, yet profoundly human, night. Children huddle near the fire's edge, small shapes wrapped in animal hides, eyes wide with curiosity, breath curling into tiny clouds. You might imagine one of them sneezing, sending a puff of mist toward a wolf in the distance, or accidentally flicking an ember into a snowbank, an absurdly harmless near disaster. The adults pay little attention, their focus on teaching, guiding, and surviving a slow-motion choreography of life, repeated over generations. Each flick of the wrist, each careful strike of stone on bone, carries lessons that will echo far into the future. Around the camp, snow glitters like scattered diamonds, reflecting firelight in 1,000 tiny sparks. The ice surrounding them is formidable, yet the humans seem unconcerned, absorbed in the quiet mastery of their environment. You notice the subtle contrast between the harshness outside and the warmth of their hearth, a juxtaposition that feels absurdly dramatic, like a tiny opera playing out on a frozen stage. Every action, from kneading animal hide to arranging firewood, speaks of ingenuity, adaptation, and the small, persistent humor that emerges even in the coldest circumstances. Look closely, and you see early art, simple etchings on bone, marks that capture animals, hunting scenes, and perhaps even abstract doodles meant to amuse themselves or record memory. You imagine a cave wall covered in scribbles that might resemble someone's first attempt at a social media post, utterly earnest, slightly chaotic, and profoundly human. The fire crackles, sending occasional sparks spiraling upward, fading into the grey sky, like miniature galaxies, born and extinguished in a single moment. Their meals are practical yet resourceful: roasted meat, gathered roots, and preserved fish, sometimes seasoned with frost or smoke, producing flavors that modern palates would call austere, yet perfectly adequate for survival. You might picture them judging today's microwave dinners and silently snickering at the absurdity of boiling water for 3 minutes, when fire and frost achieve the same purpose more dramatically. The smoke and aroma mingle, filling the cold night with a warmth that no ice can touch, a sensory reminder of ingenuity married to necessity. Occasionally, a hunter stands, spear in hand, scanning the horizon for a moving shadow, a mammoth, a bison, or perhaps a wolf. Every movement is careful, deliberate, rehearsed by centuries of observation and instinct. You can feel the tension, not alarming, but deeply respectful, a quiet acknowledgement of the dance between humans and their frozen world. The snow beneath their feet crunches softly, marking paths that will soon be erased. Yet their impact, subtle as it is, will persist in the memory of the land. Their laughter, low and private, drifts across the frozen plain, harmonizing with distant groans of glaciers and the whispering wind. For a fleeting moment, you recognize a universal truth. Life persists not because the world is accommodating, but because humans find absurdity, warmth, and connection amid adversity. Each tool, each story, each spark from flint is a testament to ingenuity, endurance, and subtle humor in the face of an uncompromising environment. Finally, you step back, taking in the entire scene. A small cluster of humans huddled by fire, surrounded by an immense frozen landscape, alive with creatures, ice, and wind. You sense the enormity of their perseverance, the quiet mastery of survival, and the faint humor they carry, unknowingly a wink from the past to anyone observing millennia later. Their choices, their stories, their lives ripple across time, echoing in rivers, mountains, and every frozen step that comes after. In watching them, you feel connected, patient, and quietly conspiratorial in your observation of humanity's enduring rhythm. Time moves in subtle pulses, Milankovitch cycles tilting the planet, nudging the ice forward or back. Centuries pass, unnoticed. The glaciers advance, retreat, and the world shifts, quietly recording these cycles in stone, snow, and memory. Let's pause and step lightly into one of these slow rhythms, where the planet itself seems to breathe in deep, silent inhalations, then exhale with glaciers inching imperceptibly forward. The air smells of frost, rock, and distant pine forests, mingling into a cold perfume that fills your lungs with patience and perspective. Every crunch of snow beneath your boots resonates with echoes of centuries, a sound both absurdly small and impossibly grand. The horizon shifts subtly, almost imperceptibly, as glaciers scrape and carve valleys. Mountains rise and fall in response to this frozen pulse. Jagged peaks softened over millennia, valleys deepened and sculpted by the patient rhythm of ice. You notice the way shadows stretch along the slopes, subtly changing with each advance and retreat of ice, creating landscapes that feel both alive and eerily deliberate, like a clockwork sculpture made by a patient, omniscient artist. Streams begin to peak from beneath frozen layers, tiny rivers that seem to sigh under the weight of centuries, whispering secrets to the land. Look closely at the snow, and you notice layers within layers, each one a record of winters long past, summers just brief flickers in comparison. Tiny air bubbles trapped in ice act like micro-libraries, preserving temperature, composition, and even whispers of storms from eras you cannot imagine. You might compare them to capsules in a time-traveling mailbox, messages from the Earth to anyone patient enough to observe. The wind carries hints of sulfur from ancient volcanic eruptions and salt from oceans that have been shifting for thousands of years, subtle reminders of the planet's immense, interconnected systems. As you watch, a glacier slowly advances down a valley, grinding rock into dust. The sound is soft but profound, like a cello played beneath layers of snow, slow, deliberate, and impossibly patient. You imagine standing on the edge of one, feeling the vibration through your boots, your legs, your chest, a quiet pulse of frozen energy. It is absurdly humbling to witness, as if the Earth itself is tapping a metronome calibrated to millennia. Beyond the glaciers, the land tells its own stories. Striations in stone, smoothed boulders, and polished riverbeds, all records of movements invisible to a human lifetime. You notice the subtle humor in the patterns rocks stacked in improbable angles, as if Earth's sense of aesthetics includes irony. It is a choreography of ice and stone, a quiet narrative that only reveals itself to those willing to linger. Above, clouds drift lazily, their shadows sliding across frozen plains in a rhythm that complements the slow movement of ice. The sun glints off icy ridges, illuminating frozen rivers that curve and twist in delicate, serpentine arcs. The contrast of light and shadow feels almost conspiratorial, like the earth is winking at you, acknowledging your attempt to follow its millennia-long story. Even the air seems to move in cycles, gusts, lulls, subtle whispers that speak of change and constancy at once. Animals respond to these slow rhythms too. Herds migrate in time with thaw and freeze. Predators follow, and smaller creatures burrow or hibernate, all moving to the invisible tempo of ice. You might imagine a fox pausing mid-step to consider whether it has enough patience for winter, or a mammoth calf testing the edge of a frozen river, curiosity tempered by instinct. The absurdity lies in their calm mastery of the rhythm, a patience that feels almost alien to your human perception of urgency. Seasonal cycles overlay the longer Milankovitch patterns. Snow comes, accumulates, melts, and sometimes lingers longer than expected. You notice how small events, like a sudden storm or volcanic dust in the atmosphere, nudge the larger cycle. Subtle perturbations that create tiny irregularities in an otherwise enormous rhythm. Life, in all its forms, responds and adapts, moving in concert with ice and sun, wind and soil, a delicate choreography of survival. You pause on a ridge, breathing in the cold, crisp air, feeling the weight of time pressing gently yet insistently against your chest. The glaciers below continue their slow march. Rivers remain frozen in anticipation, and the earth hums softly, a rhythm that has persisted for millions of years. You realize the cycles are not just mechanical movements but a meditation, a lesson in patience, endurance, and perspective. Each advance, each retreat, each millimeter of ice shifted, is a whisper of the planet's quiet humor and deliberate artistry. Finally, stepping back, you take in the landscape as a whole. Valleys carved, mountains etched, rivers paused mid-motion, and life moving subtly around these immense rhythms. You feel simultaneously tiny and intimately connected, a witness to the grand cycles that shape not just ice, but the very trajectory of life itself. And as you breathe, you recognize a comforting truth. The Earth's patience is infinite, its humor subtle, and its rhythms eternal. You, like the glaciers, are part of the quiet pulse, observing a world where time is measured not in hours or days, but in the gentle, inexorable dance of ice, stone, and wind. Even in ice, the earth moves. Volcanoes burrow below, sending warmth upward. Subterranean rivers flow. Life persists in secret places, waiting for the ice to retreat, ready to reclaim the land. Let's step lightly onto the frozen ground, listening carefully for the subtle tremors beneath your boots, vibrations so faint that only patience can reveal them. The air is paradoxically cold above and warm below, carrying the faint scent of sulfur, mineral, and wet stone. You might imagine standing over a giant Earth-sized kettle, the planet brewing slowly, quietly, and entirely unconcerned with your human schedule. Magma presses upward through unseen channels, twisting rock and creating veins of heat in a frozen world. You notice faint steam rising from cracks in the ice, disappearing into the cold air before it touches your fingertips. It is absurdly poetic, like a hidden coffee machine deep beneath the planet, brewing warmth for secret patrons who prefer their espresso with frost. Subterranean rivers snake through layers of rock, carrying minerals, nutrients, and life. invisible yet insistent, pulsing like veins in the planet's body. You imagine fish, tiny crustaceans, and microorganisms gliding along these hidden currents, oblivious to the frozen landscape above, as if attending an underground ball that has been rehearsed for millennia. Look around. The ice seems permanent, unyielding, and immobile, yet the warmth below hums quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. Rocks that appear cold and inert above ground are subtly softened from below, their crystalline structure slowly shifting under the influence of subterranean heat. You can almost feel the absurd irony. A frozen landscape, seemingly eternal, is subtly alive, a reminder that patience and persistence often go unnoticed. Occasionally, steam escapes from fissures, curling into the sky like delicate sculptures, playful and ephemeral, hinting at the dynamic life hidden beneath the frozen crust. Even mosses, lichens, and tiny plants have found refuges near these pockets of warmth, clinging to life in improbable places. You might imagine them as stubborn tenants, refusing to vacate, decorating the subterranean nooks with green banners, quietly defying the monotony of ice above. Small mammals, foxes, and burrowing rodents make their homes in these insulated regions, moving with a patience and precision that mirrors the glacier's own rhythm. They are the unsung residents of a world where ice dominates the surface, yet life thrives below, waiting for its chance to reclaim the landscape above. The smell of warm earth rises faintly, mingling with the cold scent of snow and ice. You inhale deeply, feeling the paradox, the coexistence of extremes, the dance of cold and warmth, danger and comfort, life and apparent stillness. It is absurdly comforting, like discovering a hidden fireplace in a minimalist, snow-covered mansion, unexpected, slightly ridiculous, yet profoundly necessary. You notice tiny bubbles of gas escaping from cracks, each one a messenger from the deep, whispering secrets of heat, pressure, and the slow movement of molten rock. Streams of meltwater trickle down through cracks, carrying sediments and nutrients that will one day nourish mosses, grasses, and forests once the ice retreats. You might imagine these waters as tiny messengers, delivering invitations to life waiting below, whispering, "The stage is almost ready." Insects, microorganisms, and fish inhabit these flows, their lives unnoticed by the giants above, yet integral to the ecological symphony that will eventually unfold. You can feel a conspiratorial intimacy with this hidden world, a quiet understanding that life persists, even in the most extreme and improbable places. Beneath your feet, the crust is subtly pliable. Pressure builds slowly, imperceptibly, like a heartbeat too slow for human perception. Occasionally, a minor tremor passes, barely noticeable, yet it reminds you of the immense energy stored beneath the ice. You might compare it to someone tapping rhythmically under a very large rug, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore once you notice. Above, glaciers continue their slow march, unknowing of the warmth working beneath them, yet their movement is subtly influenced, nudged imperceptibly by the hidden forces below. Steam vents, tiny geysers, and warm fissures punctuate the frozen expanse like punctuation marks in a silent manuscript. You notice how small pockets of vegetation cluster near these features, green against white, life persisting in secret places with quiet determination. The absurdity of a miniature oasis amid immense frozen emptiness is not lost on you. It feels like a hidden tea party thrown by nature itself, a subtle jest for anyone who notices. Finally, stepping back, you take in the frozen landscape and its hidden heartbeat. Ice dominates above, glaciers stretch endlessly, and snow glitters across plains and valleys. Yet below, heat flows, rivers carve secret channels, and life waits patiently for its cue. You feel privileged to witness this intimate dance between cold and warmth, surface and subsurface, visible and hidden. It is a lesson in patience, resilience, and quiet absurdity, a reminder that even in the coldest, most inhospitable places, life persists, preparing for the moment when it can once again reclaim the world above. Now, picture the ice softening, cracks appearing like veins in glass. The sun warms, the oceans swell, and landscapes change faster than a human lifetime can grasp. What was frozen is now fluid, reshaping coasts, valleys, and futures. Let's move closer, careful not to slip on the slick surfaces that have surrendered their grip. The snow beneath your boots feels damp, almost elastic, as if the land itself is awakening from a long, rigid slumber. The air carries the sharp scent of wet stone and melting snow, mingled with salt from seas rising to reclaim the coasts. You notice how the sound changes too, the quiet crunch of snow replaced by the soft trickle of water, the hum of thawing glaciers, and the distant roar of ice collapsing. Cracks widen across the ice like a spiderweb of frozen rivers, fissures tracing intricate patterns that glint in the sunlight. Tiny streams of meltwater trickle from these openings, their movement hypnotic and deliberate, a liquid ballet dancing across centuries of frozen time. You might imagine these flows as veins carrying the planet's pulse, moving urgently yet gracefully, reshaping everything without haste. The rhythm of melting is absurdly elegant, like watching honey drip slowly across a mirror, sticky and purposeful, yet mesmerizing in its inevitability. Rivers, previously trapped and silent, roar to life, racing toward the oceans, carrying sediment, rocks, and forgotten seeds. The sound is surprisingly musical, a chorus of water celebrating its newfound freedom. You might imagine the rivers as ancient musicians, finally allowed to play, each note resonating across valleys and plains. Small mammals and birds cautiously emerge from hiding places, navigating the newly liquid terrain. Their movements a dance of adaptation, curiosity, and occasional comic missteps. The absurdity of a fox slipping on a melting ice patch for a split second is somehow comforting, a reminder that even in chaos, life finds humor. Glaciers, once slow-moving titans, now hesitate and fracture, sending ice chunks tumbling into rivers like oversized dominoes. Each collapse sends up sprays of water, catching the sunlight in 1,000 sparkling arcs. You might imagine the spectacle as a grand fireworks display, orchestrated by a very patient, slightly mischievous planet. The ground beneath the melting ice softens, shifting subtly under your feet. Each step sends tiny tremors through the thawing earth, a reminder that the world beneath you is alive, moving in ways both ancient and immediate. The coasts begin to change dramatically. Land that once formed a solid barrier now submerges under rising water, creating new bays, islands, and inlets. You notice patterns forming in the landscape, streams carving channels that will guide future rivers, sediment deposited like paint on a canvas. It is absurdly beautiful, a world being repainted before your eyes, yet happening on a scale that dwarfs human comprehension. Salt water creeps inland, carrying with it a mixture of life, nutrients, and subtle disruption. You feel the strange intimacy of witnessing change so immense yet so precise, a slow-motion remake of the planet's surface. Mountains that once wore crowns of snow now show bare rock, rivulets of meltwater, carving paths downward. The air smells faintly of earth, moss, and minerals freshly exposed, a sensory reminder that ice is not just cold, but a sculptor shaping every layer it touches. The contrast between the hardness of stone and the fluidity of melting ice is striking, almost absurd, like watching a professional ballerina perform on a stage of jagged glass, dangerous, elegant, and mesmerizing simultaneously. Down in valleys, pools of meltwater collect, reflecting the sky in fractured, ever-shifting mosaics. Birds swoop down, skimming the surface, while amphibians and insects seize the opportunity to expand their territories. The movement of life mirrors the movement of water itself, careful, opportunistic, and surprisingly playful. You might imagine the valley as a stage for a subtle comedy of survival, unfolding in slow, patient acts. Snowfields collapse into streams, reshaping ridges and plains. Small waterfalls appear where none existed, cascading with a rhythm that is both chaotic and oddly musical. You notice how the sunlight catches on these waterfalls, creating miniature rainbows that arch across the landscape like fleeting invitations to wonder. Even the wind seems to adjust, whispering along newly liquid paths, carrying moisture inland, sculpting clouds that hint at storms yet to come. Finally, stepping back, you take in the transformed panorama, coasts redrawn, valleys alive with rushing water, glaciers fracturing, and life emerging cautiously to navigate a world that has suddenly become fluid. You realize that melting is not merely a physical process, it is a revelation, a gentle upheaval orchestrated on a planetary scale. And as you breathe in the crisp, wet air, you feel the intimate paradox. The ice has loosened, the land has changed, yet the rhythm of the planet remains deliberate, patient, and quietly conspiratorial, inviting you to witness, to marvel, and to understand the slow, absurd poetry of a world in transition. Water climbs inland, swallowing forests, cities, and plains. The horizon changes. Humans and animals alike must follow the retreating land, adapt, or vanish. Each wave is both gentle and unstoppable, a reminder of nature's quiet power. Let's step carefully along a rising shoreline, feeling the wet sand and softened earth yield beneath your boots. The air is thick with salt, carrying the scent of seaweed, exposed clay, and damp timber from forests now partially submerged. You notice the rhythm of the water lapping against the land, gentle yet insistent, a patient, watery pulse that reshapes everything in its path. It is absurdly beautiful, like watching a painter gently wash a landscape with a brush too large for the canvas, yet somehow perfect. The first trees begin to tremble as water reaches their roots, the sound of waves brushing bark soft yet powerful, a quiet warning that the landscape is no longer static. You might imagine the trees gossiping among themselves, leaves trembling like hands waving goodbye to creatures that will soon retreat. Animals sense the encroaching sea. Deer leap from rising pools, foxes scuttle along narrow ridges, and birds adjust their flight paths in a slow, measured panic. Each movement is deliberate, a choreography of survival dictated by the shifting waters, and you feel a conspiratorial intimacy, witnessing the quiet comedy and tragedy of life adapting in real time. The horizon bends as the seas continue their inexorable advance. Mountains that once framed distant valleys now appear as small islands in a growing ocean. Glimmers of sunlight reflect off rising waves, sparkling like fragments of broken mirrors scattered across the water. Occasionally, debris floats past, logs, frozen vegetation, and perhaps the remnants of human habitation. You might imagine these objects as postcards from a frozen past, messages carried forward in the currents, absurdly small yet poignant, reminders that even in loss, stories persist. Small rivers that once flowed into the sea now merge with the encroaching ocean, their boundaries dissolved, currents blending into vast, expanding bodies of water. You notice how sediment is carried along, coloring the waters in muted ochres and greens, a dynamic, ever-changing painting in motion. The smell here is sharp, salty, and faintly metallic, evoking distant memories of tides and storms, layered over centuries of ice and rock. You might picture this as a gourmet soup prepared by the planet itself, ingredients simmering slowly, subtly, and always in flux. In low-lying forests, animals migrate in tight formations. Herds of bison follow high ridges, wolves trail cautiously, and smaller mammals scuttle through newly forming channels. Their movements create a rhythm with the rising waters, a quiet orchestration of instinct and necessity. You notice the faint humor in some missteps. A deer slips slightly on soft mud. A fox hops awkwardly between puddles. Moments of absurdity amid a serious drama. It is comforting, almost conspiratorial, to witness these small acts of life continuing despite the vast, impersonal forces at work. Human settlements, if present, adapt as well. Temporary shelters are raised, dwellings relocated, and food caches moved inland. You might imagine the absurdity of dragging a wooden hut uphill, accompanied by complaints in an ancient, forgotten language, all while the sea whispers its unstoppable intent. Fires flicker near higher ground, smoke curling against the salty air, a small island of warmth and familiarity in a rapidly transforming world. The humans themselves move cautiously, guided by experience, observation, and a subtle humor born from necessity. Islands appear in previously lowlands, patches of safety amid the advancing sea. These become new habitats for plants and animals alike, fertile in their temporary isolation. You notice patterns in the water's edge, ripples, swirls, and eddies that suggest movement, both chaotic and deliberate, like a giant hand tracing invisible lines in the sand. Waves crash gently yet persistently against newly submerged rocks, a sound both soothing and admonishing, a reminder that nature's scale dwarfs human plans and ambitions. The horizon continues to shift. Forests, plains, and remnants of civilization are gradually absorbed into the rising tide, yet life persists, adapting, retreating, and sometimes thriving. Birds wheel overhead, fish navigate newly formed channels, and mammals follow higher ground, a quiet symphony of survival conducted by the planet itself. You feel simultaneously small and intimately connected, witnessing the intricate, patient choreography of life, responding to forces beyond comprehension. Finally, as you step back to observe the panorama, the rising seas form a dynamic sculpture, water expanding, forests shrinking, valleys filling, and life adjusting with grace, persistence, and a faintly absurd sense of humor. The waves lap gently against everything, shaping, erasing, and guiding the land into a new form. And as you breathe the salty, wet air, you realize the lesson here. The ocean moves on its own rhythm, patient, unstoppable, yet quietly beautiful. You are a witness to its slow artistry, an observer of resilience, and a participant in the subtle, endless dance of life and water. Imagine your modern world underwater. Streets become canals, skyscrapers reflect in new seas. It is unfamiliar, yet strangely poetic, a planet redesigned by ice's absence. Let's drift along these flooded avenues, noticing how cars, street signs, and familiar landmarks are transformed into underwater sculptures, their shapes distorted through layers of liquid. The air carries a hint of brine and rust, mingled with the faint aroma of damp asphalt and concrete, a strangely familiar perfume, now alien in context. Each step, or boat glide, feels like wading into a dreamscape, where gravity and memory compete, reminding you that the world you knew is now a suggestion rather than a rule. Water laps against building foundations with a gentle persistence, a quiet percussion accompanying your movement. You might imagine entire libraries and office towers silently participating in a synchronized dance, windows shimmering like piano keys catching sunlight, reflections breaking into fractal patterns on the new waterways. Trees that once lined streets now bend partially submerged, leaves brushing water surfaces, creating ripples that carry sound and shadow across channels that were once asphalt. You feel both awe and absurdity. It is your city, yet transformed beyond recognition, like a painting painted over by a very patient and slightly mischievous planet. Submerged vehicles appear as fantastical shells, interiors filled with water and floating debris, each one a tiny aquarium of human history. Occasionally, a loose tire spins in a gentle current, wobbling and drifting, a slow-motion absurdity against the silent elegance of the flooded streets. Birds glide across partially sunken traffic lights, their reflections merging with ripples below, creating a surreal kaleidoscope that seems orchestrated. You might chuckle quietly, imagining someone attempting to navigate the city in a rowboat, briefcase in hand, meeting deadlines while dodging lampposts like a very polite obstacle course. Street signs protrude above the water like islands, warnings to creatures adapted to terrestrial life, now repurposed for an aquatic world. You notice tiny fish swimming lazily around the base of lampposts, a subtle ecosystem thriving amid human artifacts. Frogs croak from balconies, insects buzz around floating debris, and algae coat surfaces once polished and pristine. The city is alive in a different way, a reminder that adaptation is not merely biological, but architectural and social as well. The faint hum of underwater currents carries a rhythm through streets, avenues, and canals, a liquid heartbeat now dominating the landscape. Buildings reflect sunlight in angles previously unnoticed, casting shadows that stretch across glassy surfaces, creating a pattern reminiscent of abstract art. You might imagine entire neighborhoods now resembling modernist aquariums, their once familiar lines refracted and reinterpreted by the water. Streetlights glimmer through ripples, forming elongated specters of themselves, like aquatic sentinels observing this quiet transformation. Occasionally, a puddle on a rooftop acts as a tiny mirror, showing a sky that seems closer, bluer, and infinitely larger when seen through liquid lenses. Submerged parks and playgrounds are quietly reclaimed by nature. Trees grow in shallow pools, their roots partially underwater, while birds perch on slides, now acting as miniature piers. You notice squirrels navigating floating debris like agile tightrope walkers, adding a layer of absurd humor to the scene. The juxtaposition of mundane human structures with subtle ecological reinvention makes you realize that resilience has a peculiar poetry. Life adapts, and humans, inadvertently or otherwise, provide new opportunities for other species. Sidewalks are now submerged walkways, algae coating the stone and brick with a gentle green sheen. Occasionally, a wave slaps a surface, disturbing floating leaves and creating ripples that radiate across entire blocks. You might imagine these ripples as whispered conversations between the earth and its inhabitants, messages carried in water rather than wind. Buses and cars are motionless, turned into sculptures by circumstance, their interiors sometimes home to small schools of fish, transforming mundane objects into fantastical aquascapes. Bridges now function as above-water corridors, their reflection in the liquid below doubling the visual effect. You notice the distorted symmetry, the quiet elegance of their arches, and the sense that architecture itself is participating in a subtle improvisation, a gentle ballet with water as the dance floor. The city feels simultaneously familiar and completely alien, like walking through a memory refracted through a lens of surrealism. Finally, as you step back and observe the panorama. Skyscrapers jut from the water like islands. Streets are now shimmering canals, and parks glint under sunlight filtered through ripples. You realize that the flooded city is not a ruin, but a transformation, a playful, poetic, and absurdly resilient reimagining of urban life. The rhythm of water, light, and survival combines to create a gentle narrative, teaching patience, adaptation, and the quiet joy of observing change. You breathe in the salty air, feeling both small and intimately connected, a participant in the enduring dance of life, water, and time. Migration becomes necessary. Herds wander, humans seek higher ground, plants follow new climates. Survival is a delicate balance between opportunity and disaster, patience and motion. Let's move alongside them, stepping carefully on softened soil and debris-laden paths, feeling the subtle give of earth reshaped by floodwaters and melting ice. The air is thick with the scent of wet vegetation, salt, and distant smoke from fires cautiously tended by humans moving inland. You notice the rhythm of life here, the deliberate shuffle of hooves, the soft crackle of footsteps in mud, and the faint rustle of leaves disturbed by small animals adjusting to a rapidly changing landscape. Herds of bison and deer traverse newly formed ridges, navigating channels and streams that did not exist yesterday. Their movements are purposeful yet chaotic, a slow-motion ballet of instinct and necessity. You might imagine them consulting some invisible, absurdly meticulous map, drawn only in the language of survival. Wolves and predators trail carefully, aware of shifting terrain, testing paths, and sometimes pausing with almost comical patience, as if debating whether the shortcut across the flooded plain is worth the risk. Every step carries tension and opportunity, the fine line between safety and danger palpable beneath the crisp air. Humans follow higher ground, carrying tools, children, and sometimes livestock. You might picture a family lugging a small wooden cart over muddy embankments, slipping slightly, muttering in an ancient dialect, yet continuing onward with the absurd determination of anyone moving mountains, or at least slopes and puddles. Fires flicker along ridgelines, smoke spiraling into the sky, marking temporary shelters, providing warmth and signaling both survival and resilience. You notice the ingenuity, makeshift bridges, raised platforms, and carefully managed supply caches, adaptations crafted on the fly in response to the shifting environment. Plants, too, are on the move. Seeds drift on water, germinate in newly moist soil, and colonize freshly exposed banks. Small shrubs push through softened clay, their roots anchoring soil before the next tide arrives. Mosses cling to rocks, partially submerged, their green, vibrant against muted greys and browns. You might imagine the absurdity of tiny plants, quietly establishing territories in a world dominated by enormous, migrating creatures, as if claiming dominion one microstep at a time. The air carries a symphony of movement. Bird calls echo across new valleys, insect wings buzz against leaves, and the distant rumble of shifting ice or rock underscores the constant, patient motion of the landscape itself. Streams twist and braid as they follow the meltwater, redirecting animals, humans, and seeds alike. You notice the faint humor in the patterning. A fox pauses on a log, a child steps into a shallow puddle, a bird swoops too low, subtle moments of absurdity in the larger drama of survival. Herds navigate obstacles created by newly formed channels, fallen trees, and softened banks. You notice how the ice, though receding, continues to influence movement, directing flows of animals like a silent, omnipresent conductor. Humans respond in turn, altering routes, assisting livestock, and observing wildlife patterns. Adjusting with patience that borders on theatrical absurdity, a person may gesture at a fleeing deer as though conducting an orchestra of survival. The sunlight shifts as the day progresses, glinting off rippling water and wet leaves, casting ever-changing shadows across the terrain. Snow patches linger on northern slopes, melting slowly and feeding temporary streams. You notice how animals and humans alike adjust instinctively to the angle of the sun, the depth of shadow, and the wetness of soil, creating a choreography dictated by observation, intuition, and necessity. Every movement is deliberate, yet adaptive, a quiet ballet set to the soundtrack of a world in flux. Small birds hop along newly exposed riverbanks, insects flit from plant to plant, and fish navigate braided channels. You might imagine them as an absurdly precise logistics team, managing survival, reproduction, and food gathering in a way that seems impossibly organized yet entirely natural. Even the wind participates, carrying seeds, stirring water, and cooling moving bodies, a silent partner in the perpetual migration dance. Finally, as you step back and take in the panorama, you see humans, animals, and plants navigating a world reshaped by water and ice. Ridges, channels, and rising seas create a dynamic map, ever-changing, ever-demanding adaptation. You feel intimately connected to this choreography, a witness to patience, risk, ingenuity, and subtle humor woven into the fabric of life itself. Migration is not just movement. It is a story of endurance, strategy, and grace. A reminder that even in an unstable world, life continues with rhythm, resilience, and sometimes absurd elegance. Where ice once rained, forests bloom. Rainwater nurtures seedlings, while sun melts snow into fertile soil. Life bursts forward, a slow but unstoppable reclaiming of the land. Let's step softly into one of these recovering woodlands, noticing how the air feels heavier, warmer, and filled with the earthy scent of moss, wet bark, and decomposing leaves. Each inhale carries a sense of renewal, a quiet assurance that the frozen past is giving way to vibrancy and growth. Sunlight filters through newly sprouted leaves, casting shifting patterns across the forest floor, almost as if the earth is playing a gentle game of light and shadow with anyone patient enough to observe. Young trees push upward through soft, thawed soil, their roots reaching deep, anchoring themselves in what was once compacted ice. The branches sway lightly in the wind, leaves shimmering like delicate green flags, signaling life's return. You might imagine the trees gossiping in a subtle, plant-like language, exchanging news of water flow, sunlight, and soil nutrients. Small animals cautiously emerge. Squirrels dart along branches, insects crawl across newly exposed bark, and birds flit between shoots, their movements a playful contrast to the slow, deliberate growth of the forest itself. The soundscape is gentle yet alive. Tiny streams trickle down moss-covered stones, creating rhythmic, whispering melodies. Leaves rustle in the breeze, punctuated by distant calls of returning wildlife. You notice the faint humor in the juxtaposition. A tiny mouse leaps across a puddle, as if testing the limits of gravity, while an oversized fern slowly unfurls its fronds with exaggerated patience. Even the subtle movements of fungi, spreading spores, seem choreographed in a quiet, absurd ballet of persistence. Sunlight melts patches of lingering snow, feeding the soil and giving life to seedlings in every crack and crevice. The contrast between wet, soft soil and the crisp remains of frost creates a sensory richness underfoot. Every step presses down a mixture of mud, moss, and fallen leaves, producing a gentle squelch that harmonizes with the sounds of moving water and distant birds. You might imagine the soil itself laughing quietly, delighted by the sudden abundance and activity, a conspiratorial partner in the forest's recovery. Lichens and mosses cover rocks and fallen logs, softening edges and creating microhabitats for insects, amphibians, and tiny mammals. The textures under your hands range from velvety to slightly abrasive, each surface telling a story of survival and slow adaptation. You notice small saplings peeking through the understory, tentative yet bold, establishing themselves in sunlight that was once trapped by snow. The absurdity of tiny plants boldly asserting themselves in a post-ice world is quietly humorous, like miniature rebels claiming territory with exaggerated determination. Water channels carve gentle paths through the forest floor, carrying nutrients and seeds along their way. Occasionally, a frog or salamander pauses mid-hop, surveying the new landscape, while insects hitch rides on floating leaves. You might imagine these animals as tiny engineers, testing bridges, pathways, and escape routes in a world suddenly transformed. The rhythm of their movements blends with dripping water, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch, creating a symphony both chaotic and harmonious. Birds return in small flocks, hopping between branches and swooping through the gaps in the canopy. Their calls echo lightly, bouncing off the trees and filling the space with life. You notice how even their behavior seems influenced by the recovering forest, timing flights and foraging with the subtle cues of light, water, and sound. The forest is a delicate balance of growth and caution, playfulness and survival, absurdly precise in its orchestration. Fallen logs decompose slowly, nurturing fungi and new plants alike. Tiny seeds, carried by water, wind, or animals, sprout in unlikely places, turning cracks and crevices into small bursts of green. You might imagine a seed pausing mid-growth, considering whether this patch of soil will offer enough sun or water, anthropomorphizing a world that is patient, observant, and quietly humorous. The diversity of textures, rough bark, soft moss, slippery leaves, creates an intimate, tactile experience as you explore the forest floor. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama. Trees stretching skyward, streams flowing gently, moss and saplings carpeting the land, and wildlife moving cautiously yet confidently. Life is reclaiming what ice once dominated, patiently, humorously, and inevitably. You feel both small and connected, a witness to the quiet persistence of nature, observing a world reshaped by thaw and time, rhythmically alive and absurdly magnificent. The forest's reclamation is a story written in green, water, and life itself, a narrative of patience, adaptability, and the subtle, conspiratorial humor of the natural world. Imagine parched land transformed, sand shifts to mud, arid canyons flood with new streams, carving paths for animals, humans, and chance. Let's step carefully into this suddenly softened world, feeling the ground beneath your boots, squish and shift with each step, the sand and clay melding into a living, malleable surface. The air carries a faint, earthy aroma, rich with minerals released by the water's touch, mingling with the delicate scent of wet vegetation, suddenly reclaiming arid spaces. You notice the sound of flowing water, crisp and musical, carving channels that twist, turn, and braid through the previously unyielding landscape, a symphony of motion in a place that once seemed frozen in stillness. Small rivulets form, winding through dune valleys and cracking dry soil, carrying sediments, seeds, and nutrients along their journey. You might imagine the streams as tiny architects, subtly sculpting the desert into a more hospitable stage for life, with the absurd patience of a cosmic gardener. Occasional pools collect in depressions, reflecting the sky and distant cliffs like natural mirrors, creating illusions of rivers stretching beyond the horizon. Fish, amphibians, and insects appear as if by magic, colonizing these new waterways, testing paths, and establishing habitats in a landscape that has only just been rewritten. The desert wind shifts as water spreads across it, carrying humidity, the scent of mud, and occasional bursts of flowering seeds. Trees and shrubs, previously dormant, respond immediately, sending roots deep into softened soil and pushing leaves toward the sunday. You notice the subtle humor in this rapid transformation. What once seemed impossibly barren is now a bustling laboratory of life, with plants deciding where to settle, as if consulting a natural council. Birds flit along the new streams, diving to catch insects emerging from the mud, while small mammals navigate slippery banks with a comical blend of caution and curiosity. The newly formed streams carve canyons deeper and wider, washing away sand and shaping rock into smooth, polished forms. You might imagine this process as the earth doodling elaborate patterns in a notebook of stone, playful yet deliberate. Occasionally, a boulder shifts, revealing tiny pockets of hidden life moss, lichens, or trapped insects like secret treasures revealed by the water's persistence. The contrast between arid slopes and liquid pathways is striking, absurdly poetic, and entirely mesmerizing, as if the desert has been given a second chance at improvisational artistry. Humans, if present, move along the edges of these streams, seeking fertile patches for crops or safer ground for temporary shelters. You might imagine someone balancing on a narrow ridge, a sack of supplies in hand, carefully stepping through mud as if walking a tightrope in an invisible circus. Fires flicker near safe areas, smoke curling into the humid air, signaling both warmth and adaptation. You notice their ingenuity in bridging streams, redirecting water, and observing wildlife patterns. A quiet, conspiratorial partnership with the newly liquid desert. The sound of flowing water dominates the landscape, yet it is punctuated by small, absurd interruptions. A frog hopping into a pool, a bird squawking as it loses footing, or a branch sliding into the water with a gentle splash. These tiny moments of chaos blend seamlessly with the broader rhythm, adding humor and vitality to a landscape otherwise dominated by transformation. You feel a quiet intimacy with the scene, witnessing life navigating opportunity and risk with subtle elegance. Sand dunes collapse and reform as water courses through them, creating miniature waterfalls and swirling eddies. Each ripple carries sediment and seeds, creating fertile pockets along banks and in depressions. You might imagine these pools as tiny theaters, hosting countless microdramas of life. Tadpoles swim cautiously, insects hunt strategically, and seeds germinate with deliberate patience, their green shoots pushing through mud with absurd determination. The sun glints off wet rocks and water surfaces, casting reflections that dance across canyon walls. Shadows shift subtly with every passing cloud and ripple, enhancing the sense of movement and life. The previously barren desert now teems with color. Mosses, grasses, shrubs, and flowering plants respond to moisture, while animals navigate their new terrain with instinct, curiosity, and sometimes comical missteps. Each movement is a testament to resilience, adaptation, and the inherent humor of life, finding its way in unexpected circumstances. Finally, stepping back, you take in the transformed desert, streams braiding across sand, cliffs softened by water, patches of green flourishing, and wildlife adjusting gracefully. Life moves with patience and urgency, humor and elegance, reshaping the land once dominated by aridity. You realize that deserts, like all landscapes, are not fixed. They breathe, shift, and recover, creating a narrative of endurance, adaptability, and subtle absurdity. You feel connected, a witness to the slow, playful reclaiming of a world once parched and still, now alive with movement, rhythm, and the quiet poetry of water returning to forgotten places. As ice melts, minerals and nutrients locked in frozen layers wash into the oceans. Tiny chemical shifts ripple through the ecosystem, unseen but profound, shaping the future of life in ways subtle and magnificent. Let's step quietly along a melting glacier's edge, feeling the soft, wet sediment beneath your boots, and inhale the crisp, mineral-rich air. There is a faint, metallic tang, a scent that carries the memory of centuries trapped in ice, mingled with the freshness of thawing snow. You notice how every droplet of meltwater carries a story, traces of iron, phosphorus, and carbon, slowly leaching into streams, rivers, and eventually oceans, delivering nutrients like invisible letters to distant ecosystems. Water trickles over rock, forming rivulets that sparkle in sunlight, each channel a miniature conveyor belt carrying essential elements. You might imagine these chemical shifts as tiny postal workers, delivering messages to plankton, fish, and algae, orchestrating a slow, invisible symphony of growth. Salt mixes with minerals, creating currents that ripple with subtle complexity. A quiet dance, too small for human eyes, but profound in its impact. Tiny organisms, from bacteria to microscopic plankton, respond instantly, multiplying, shifting, and thriving, shaping the foundation of food chains that will support entire ecosystems. The ocean, previously balanced delicately, now receives this infusion with patience and precision. Currents carry these dissolved elements across vast distances, seeding life in previously nutrient-poor regions. You notice the absurd poetry of it all. A glacier melting in the north feeds microscopic blooms thousands of miles away, a reminder that even the smallest actions have cosmic consequences. Occasionally, you glimpse a tiny bubble rising from a submerged rock, a visual punctuation marking the movement of unseen chemistry beneath the surface. Shorelines change as sediment washes ashore, carrying not just minerals but microscopic life, algae spores, and plant seeds, creating fertile patches in areas that were once barren. You might imagine a grain of phosphorus winking at a passing crab, or a droplet of iron sharing a joke with a plankton. Subtle humor embedded in a vast, unseen network. Even the wind participates, lifting evaporated water and redistributing salts and minerals, creating a dynamic, interconnected system of chemical and physical processes. Underwater, coral reefs respond to these subtle shifts. Algae blooms flourish, small fish multiply, and the tiniest invertebrates adjust feeding behaviors. The changes are gradual, yet unstoppable, a quiet reminder that life is adaptive and endlessly patient. You might imagine a shrimp pausing mid-swim to inspect the newly enriched water, considering its options, utterly serious in its absurdly small yet essential role. Waves carry chemical signatures along coasts, nourishing estuaries and tidal pools, creating pockets of opportunity for species that have waited centuries for such a moment. Meltwater rivers feed into the deep ocean, creating layers of varying density, temperature, and salinity. You notice how these subtle shifts influence ocean currents, mixing nutrients and altering climates in ways both predictable and astonishingly complex. Tiny chemical nudges ripple through plankton populations, affecting fish migration patterns, feeding behaviors, and reproductive cycles. You feel a conspiratorial intimacy with this process, observing forces so small yet so essential that the entire biosphere hinges on them. Occasionally, volcanic hot springs below the ice add their own chemical contributions. Sulfur, calcium, and trace metals enrich local waters, creating tiny oases of life. Microbes flourish in these niches, their activity invisible yet profoundly influential, forming the basis for entire ecosystems. You might imagine these microbes as eccentric artists, painting their existence across minerals and sediment, leaving subtle marks that will influence generations of life. Above water, rivers become conduits for nutrients to coastal ecosystems. Wetlands emerge, marsh grasses flourish, and birds and mammals adjust foraging patterns in response to new growth. Tiny changes ripple outward. A nitrogen boost in one stream alters plant growth, attracting insects, which attract birds, creating cascading effects that reach far beyond the initial chemical infusion. You might chuckle at the absurd precision of nature's chemistry, like an invisible clockwork performing a grand, slow-motion performance. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama: glaciers melting, streams flowing, oceans slowly enriched, and ecosystems subtly responding. Minerals and nutrients, once locked in ice, now circulate in a quiet, invisible symphony, shaping life with patience, persistence, and occasional absurdity. You feel both small and intimately connected, witnessing the profound yet hidden influence of chemistry on a world reborn by thaw, a reminder that even invisible forces leave lasting marks on the planet and its inhabitants. Ancient ice-dammed lakes spill, reshaping topography. Their waters carry stories of the past, sediments heavy with history, whispering to anyone who will listen. Let's step cautiously along the edge of one of these sudden bodies of water, feeling the damp soil shift beneath your boots, each step leaving impressions that will soon be erased by ripples or waves. The air carries a scent both sweet and earthy, a mixture of wet vegetation, exposed clay, and faint traces of minerals long locked within the ice. You notice how sunlight glints across the surface, casting reflections that seem to move independently, a subtle, playful dance, orchestrated by water and wind. The lake stretches across what was once frozen ground, its boundaries shifting unpredictably as ice continues to melt upstream. Tiny streams feed into it, carrying mineral-rich waters, detritus, and life itself, a slow, patient transport system connecting glaciers, rivers, and ecosystems. You might imagine these streams as invisible couriers, delivering letters and parcels to distant species, tiny agents of change that shape everything from plankton populations to fish migration. Occasionally, small rocks tumble into the water, creating concentric ripples that expand and fade like whispers from the past, a visual echo of time itself. Sediments settle in layers along the lake bed, each a record of centuries: volcanic ash, mineral deposits, and organic remains. You might imagine them as pages in a diary, each one a note from Earth documenting storms, floods, and freezes, awaiting an attentive observer to read. Microorganisms thrive here, invisible yet essential, feeding on nutrients and shaping chemical balances that ripple upward through the food chain. You notice how small these forces are individually, yet how profoundly they influence life in and around the lake. A quiet orchestration, invisible to all but the most patient eye. Around the shores, early plants begin to take root in soft mud, stabilizing the banks and creating microhabitats for insects, amphibians, and small mammals. The juxtaposition of soft greenery against the vast reflective surface of water is absurdly beautiful, like placing a single leaf carefully onto a vast glossy mirror. Birds dip and swoop over the lake, picking off insects disturbed by shifting sediment, while frogs and small reptiles explore the newly nourished ground. Each movement contributes to a symphony of life, orchestrated by water, wind, and sediment in perfect harmony. Glacial ice occasionally carves into the lake, sending waves across the surface. You might imagine each fragment as a miniature ship, tiny icebergs carrying frozen history, drifting lazily while reflecting the sky in shards of brilliance. The sound of impact resonates subtly, a quiet percussion against the gentle lapping of water on muddy banks. You feel a conspiratorial intimacy with this moment, as though the earth is sharing its secrets with anyone willing to listen, revealing stories written in ice and sediment, waiting patiently for comprehension. The lake's surface shimmers with changing light, waves reflecting clouds, sun, and the surrounding cliffs. You notice the absurd poetry of shadows stretching and bending across water, rocks, and emergent vegetation, shapes constantly shifting, fleeting, yet perfectly coherent in their randomness. Tiny fish navigate newly formed channels, their scales flashing in sunlight, a reminder that life adapts instantly when opportunity appears. You imagine the fish gossiping silently with each ripple, exchanging news of food, predators, and subtle changes in water chemistry. Submerged logs, partially encased in mud, serve as homes for insects and shelter for amphibians. Algae bloom along the edges, providing sustenance for countless creatures. You might imagine these logs as tiny floating cities, microcosms of society functioning independently, yet connected by water and sediment. The absurdity of miniature urban life unfolding silently under your gaze. The patterns in mud and water currents act like maps, guiding future animals, humans and plants, along paths subtly dictated by hydrodynamics and patience. Occasionally, a gust of wind sweeps across the lake, sending ripples racing to the opposite shore. The sound is hypnotic, like a whispering choir recounting history in liquid tones. Sediment clouds the shallows, carrying nutrients and microscopic life that will feed generations to come. You notice the subtle humor in this. The lake is both calm and restless, patient yet insistent, a natural paradox enacted in perfect balance. Finally, as you step back and take in the panorama, the lake gleams under sunlight, surrounded by partially thawed banks, young vegetation, and wildlife moving cautiously along its shores. Sediment layers tell tales of centuries, icebergs drift with quiet dignity, and the water continues to shape the land slowly but inexorably. You feel intimately connected to this scene, witnessing a world where time, water, and life collaborate in subtle, absurdly precise artistry. The forgotten lakes are not truly forgotten. They whisper their stories to anyone attentive enough to listen, a testament to endurance, adaptation, and the quiet poetry of a world in motion. With ice gone, wind patterns change. Hurricanes, monsoons, and storm systems adapt to new shapes of land and water. The world breathes differently, weather moving in unfamiliar rhythms. Let's stand on a ridge and feel the currents swirl around you, carrying scents of rain, salt, and freshly exposed earth. The air hums with energy, invisible yet palpable, teasing your hair and the edges of your clothing as it dances unpredictably across valleys and plains. It is both exhilarating and absurdly delicate, like trying to hold a conversation with a breeze that has its own plans. The absence of polar ice alters the planet's pulse. Jet streams meander unpredictably, winds twist over newly formed coastlines, and the air carries warmth and cold in curious, surprising combinations. You notice how subtle temperature differences spark storms in places previously calm, creating miniature weather systems that ripple across continents. Clouds gather and disperse, sometimes forming dramatic spirals, sometimes simply drifting lazily, as if the sky itself is experimenting with new choreography. The pattern of the wind feels conspiratorial, a secret game the earth plays, and you are allowed a glimpse only because you are patient enough to observe. Hurricanes form differently now, spinning over warmer waters, their centers more compact, their edges unpredictable. You can hear the distant rumble, soft at first, a muted percussion beneath the sky, growing into a rhythm that hints at enormous power, yet moves with an almost polite precision. You might imagine the storms comparing notes like cosmic meteorologists, each one trying to outdo the last in elegance and intensity, subtly amused by the humans watching helplessly from shorelines and hills. The absurdity of gigantic forces following patterns that are both calculated and whimsical is oddly comforting when you surrender to observation rather than control. Monsoons shift, arriving at unfamiliar times, drenching plains and valleys, nudging rivers into new courses, and reshaping ecosystems. You notice how plants respond almost instantaneously, leaves bending toward rain, roots absorbing moisture, and seeds germinating in patches previously too dry. Small animals emerge cautiously, adapting foraging behaviors to the new water cycles. Birds adjust migration paths with careful precision, while insects exploit the moist air for reproductive advantage. You might imagine this as a global orchestra, each species contributing notes in perfect harmony to an invisible, ever-changing score conducted by the wind. Gusts whip through canyons and along coastlines, sculpting dunes, shifting sand, and stirring debris in miniature tornadoes. You feel the pull on your clothing, the whisper of moving air along your skin, and the subtle exhilaration of standing amid forces both immense and playful. Occasional bursts of wind carry distant scents of warm earth, evaporated water, and freshly exposed minerals, layering complexity upon complexity in the sensory landscape. The world feels alive in a way that demands humility, observation, and quiet delight. Storm systems interact, creating dramatic but fleeting spectacles. Sudden rain showers, swirling clouds, and lightning that dances along ridges. You notice the absurdity in the variety. A single gust might form miniature vortices, tossing leaves or small stones, while nearby, the sun breaks through in a perfect spotlight on a patch of forest or river. Life below adapts subtly yet instantly, the forest floor shifting from dry to slick, birds altering flight patterns, and small mammals finding shelter in newly formed nooks. You sense the conspiratorial humor of nature, quietly mocking assumptions of permanence, predictability, or control. Even open plains are affected. Winds channel through valleys, lifting seeds, dust, and sand, distributing nutrients over previously barren regions. You can almost see the invisible hand of the atmosphere, painting landscapes, delivering tiny parcels of fertility and life, while animals navigate these ever-shifting terrains. Occasionally, the wind whispers through grasses, creating a soft, continuous rustle, a sound both calming and energizing, reminding you of the subtle music embedded in movement. Ice remnants at higher latitudes create microclimates, pockets of cooler air, swirling snow showers, and occasional hail. These localized effects interact with larger systems, producing unpredictable but graceful choreography. You notice small animals exploiting these patterns, birds gliding on thermals, foxes skirting wet gullies, and fish adjusting their movements in streams, now fed by variable meltwater. Each response is precise, adaptive, and often humorous in its ingenuity. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama: coastlines shaped by rising seas, plains molded by wind, rivers meandering unpredictably, and storm systems orchestrating a subtle, ever-changing rhythm. The planet breathes in a new cadence, the poles no longer icebound, the atmosphere adjusted to a different energy balance. You feel small, intimately connected, and quietly conspiratorial as you witness the Earth's invisible hand at work, crafting wind, storms, and rain in an endlessly patient, absurdly elegant, and profoundly alive dance. Some animals vanish, others evolve. Tiny fish thrive in newly created rivers, mammals relocate, birds chart new migratory paths. Survival is innovation on an epic scale. Let's follow these creatures through landscapes reshaped by ice melt, rising seas, and shifting rivers, noticing how every movement is a lesson in adaptation. The air is alive with scents of fresh water, damp soil, and vegetation that has quickly colonized newly fertile banks. You notice how subtle changes a newly exposed rock, a shifting stream, or a patch of emerging vegetation immediately alter behavior, prompting small yet precise adjustments in movement, diet, and habitat. Fish dart through clear pools in braided rivers, scales flashing in sunlight refracted by rippling water. Their behavior is almost choreographed, weaving through currents, exploring new paths, and exploiting temporary refuges. You might imagine them as tiny, aquatic engineers, surveying the newly available channels and plotting routes as efficiently as any human cartographer. Insects emerge to exploit the nutrient-rich water, buzzing, flitting, and darting with precision, creating a subtle visual rhythm that complements the water's movement. Small amphibians hop cautiously along muddy banks, timing each leap with care, responding to predator and prey alike in an intricate, improvised ballet. Mammals navigate the transformed terrain with quiet ingenuity. Deer hop across newly exposed ridges, foxes slip along wet gullies, and rodents dig burrows in soft soil, softened by meltwater. You might imagine a fox pausing mid-step, tilting its head as if calculating whether to leap over a flooded path or wait for it to recede. Their adaptations are rapid, often absurdly clever, reminding you that necessity breeds creativity on a scale far larger than human perception. Even the smallest creatures seem aware of the impermanence of their environment, moving, hiding, or exploiting opportunities with calculated grace. Birds are the most visible indicators of adaptation. Migratory paths shift, flocks following the distribution of food and safe nesting locations. You notice how they wheel in the sky, sometimes forming spirals over fertile plains, sometimes splitting to navigate unpredictable currents of wind reshaped by melting ice and open water. Their calls echo across valleys, rivers, and lakes, communicating positions, warnings, and perhaps even the subtle humor of life, adjusting to change. You might imagine them gossiping about which stream has the best fish, their tiny absurd concerns layered atop the grand narrative of planetary adaptation. Even plants participate in adaptation, though more slowly. Seeds carried by water, wind, and animal movement sprout in new, unexpected locations, altering the microhabitats of insects, small mammals, and amphibians. You notice mosses and lichens colonizing rocky outcrops where ice once pressed, creating miniature ecosystems that support small insect populations and provide camouflage for tiny mammals. The interactions are complex yet natural, a quiet symphony of survival playing out in parallel with water and wind, ice and soil. Predators adjust too. Wolves, big cats, and birds of prey follow prey into new territories, sometimes exploiting corridors created by rising water or shifting ice. You notice how subtly they adjust hunting strategies, timing, stalking paths, and group coordination, all tuned to the newly sculpted landscape. Occasionally, a predator misjudges a slope or stream, creating moments of absurd comedy amid survival, a reminder that even in serious adaptation, life maintains its humor. Fish populations in newly formed rivers rapidly exploit nutrient-rich zones, their numbers swelling with abundant food. Tiny crustaceans and insects multiply in lockstep, feeding larger fish and forming the foundation for complex food webs. You might imagine them as a miniature underwater city thriving beneath your gaze, bustling with activity, invisible to most observers, yet essential to ecosystem balance. The rhythm of adaptation extends beyond land and water. Air currents carry seeds, spores, and even small insects to locations far from their original homes, facilitating colonization in areas previously uninhabitable. Birds and flying mammals exploit these currents, timing flights to conserve energy, move efficiently, and locate resources with almost comical precision. The interplay between mobility, opportunity, and survival is both elegant and subtly absurd. Finally, stepping back, you observe a panorama of life, adjusting gracefully to a transformed world. Rivers teem with fish, forests and wetlands are alive with birds, mammals, and insects, and microhabitats flourish with plant colonization. Each species demonstrates patience, ingenuity, and quiet humor, responding to a landscape reshaped by ice, water, and wind. You feel intimately connected to this intricate dance of adaptation, a witness to the slow, patient, and often playful innovation that ensures survival across every scale of life. Societies rethink everything: architecture, diet, migration. Coastal cities transform into floating settlements. Farmland shifts inland. Civilization persists, but differently, more fluidly, like water itself. Let's move carefully through one of these transformed landscapes, observing how humans adjust to the new world, while water claims streets, plazas, and parks. The air is rich with salt, wet earth, and the smoke of fires tended cautiously along higher ground or floating platforms. You notice how the soundscape has shifted. The soft lapping of water replaces the hum of engines, and birds and amphibians add new melodies, creating an acoustic environment both familiar and astonishing. Buildings are modified or relocated entirely. Wooden platforms rise above rising tides, while stone foundations are fortified against fluctuating water levels. You might imagine someone dragging a small hut across a flooded street, muttering under their breath, performing a slow-motion absurd ballet of adaptation. Waterways become streets, and small boats replace wagons and carts, creating a rhythm of movement dictated by tides rather than traffic signals. The ingenuity on display is astonishing. Every structure, pathway, and bridge becomes a carefully negotiated compromise with the environment. People adapt diets too. Coastal communities harvest fish from new canals, while inland populations cultivate crops in soil newly exposed or enriched by floodwaters. You might imagine someone juggling buckets of vegetables while dodging a duck or a floating log, a quiet moment of absurd humor amid survival. Fires are used to cook meals safely on floating platforms or terraces above water, creating small islands of warmth and routine in a shifting, fluid landscape. Humans become adept at improvisation, subtly adjusting practices that were once rigid, embracing flexibility as a survival skill. Migration patterns shift dramatically. Families relocate to higher ground, often carrying livestock, tools, and possessions in boats or on makeshift rafts. You notice the subtle choreography. Children balance on narrow platforms, adults row through narrow channels, and animals move cautiously alongside humans, learning new paths. The rhythm of daily life adapts to the pace of tides and seasonal changes, creating a fluid yet surprisingly precise pattern of survival. It is almost comical to imagine people timing their commute like sailors, rather than pedestrians, synchronized with water, rather than clocks. Communication changes as well. Messages travel via boats, floating carriers, or signaling fires, relying on visible cues and natural rhythms rather than stationary infrastructure. You might notice someone waving across a canal to a neighbor, their gestures amplified by the reflective water, forming a silent, playful dialogue. Even festivals and social gatherings adjust. Celebrations take place on floating platforms, in partially submerged squares, or along newly formed riverbanks. The absurdity and adaptability of human culture shine through, highlighting both resilience and humor in the face of transformation. Coastal agriculture evolves. Terraces, raised beds, and floating gardens appear, taking advantage of nutrient-rich soil left by receding waters. You notice subtle innovations: water channels feeding plants efficiently, nets to catch drifting seeds, and small barriers preventing erosion. People collaborate with nature in ways previously unnecessary, forming a tacit partnership with the environment, orchestrating survival with patience, ingenuity, and subtle humor. Transport is transformed. Canals replace streets, small rowboats glide between homes, and bridges are repurposed or raised. You might imagine someone gliding past a half-submerged market stall, exchanging vegetables for fish while avoiding floating debris, a delicate dance of logistics that combines absurdity, creativity, and practicality. Children learn to swim, balance, or row before they can walk normally across certain areas, a remarkable adaptation to a world dominated by water. The climate, now altered by melting ice, dictates behavior. Rains, winds, and tidal changes are carefully observed and accounted for in daily routines. Fires, water collection, and food storage are timed to environmental cues, creating a rhythm of life synchronized with natural cycles, rather than rigid human schedules. You notice how human communities have become both observant and playful, using humor and creativity to navigate challenges that would have seemed insurmountable a generation ago. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama: floating homes, irrigated farmland, canals replacing streets, and communities thriving amid change. Humans have not disappeared. They have adapted with grace, ingenuity, and subtle humor, responding to rising seas and shifting land. Civilization persists, but differently, more fluid, observant, and intimately connected to the rhythms of the environment. You feel both small and part of the continuum, witnessing a species reimagining its place in a world transformed by water, ice, and time, resilient, adaptive, and quietly absurdly inventive. Even gone, the ice leaves traces erratics, carved valleys, chemical signatures in rocks and water. The earth remembers, subtly guiding those who follow in its paths. Let's step carefully along a glacially carved valley, noticing the enormous boulders scattered across the landscape, each one a relic of ice that once pressed with immense, deliberate force. The air carries a faint mineral scent, mixed with wet soil and the crisp aroma of melting snow. Every breath seems to carry the weight of centuries, a subtle reminder that even vanished ice has left behind stories in the very fabric of the land. Erratic boulders, plucked from distant mountains and transported across valleys, sit like silent witnesses. You might imagine them gossiping with one another in slow, patient murmurs, comparing notes on where they've traveled over millennia. Their size and placement are absurdly impressive. Giant stones perched in improbable positions, seemingly arranged by a whimsical architect with both a sense of humor and perfect geological memory. Tiny plants take root around them, mosses and lichens clinging to their surfaces, creating miniature ecosystems that celebrate survival and subtle absurdity in the presence of monumental history. Valleys carved by glaciers stretch before you, U-shaped and smooth, a landscape shaped by patience and immense pressure. Streams now run where ice once dominated, carrying sediment, minerals, and life into lakes and rivers below. You notice how the curves and slopes suggest motion even in stillness, a record of forces too slow and immense for human perception, yet profoundly influential. It is as if the earth has left instructions written in rock and soil, subtle guides for anyone paying attention. Follow the valley, explore the stream, respect the rhythm of movement that once dictated the flow of ice. Chemical traces, embedded in rocks and sediments, tell the story of ice's presence. Iron, phosphorus, and other minerals are left behind, influencing soil fertility, water chemistry, and ecological development. You might imagine these chemicals as secret messages, invisible, yet profound, whispering instructions to plants, microbes, and even humans who live nearby. Every stream, fed by glacial melt, carries nutrients downstream, forming a slow, subtle chain reaction that affects rivers, wetlands, and coastal ecosystems. The absurdity of tiny elements holding such profound influence is not lost on you. Small forces, vast consequences. As you walk, you notice striations on rock surfaces, scratches etched by rocks embedded in moving glaciers. Each groove tells a tale of patient, relentless motion over centuries, a quiet record of ice's negotiation with stone. You might imagine a glacier polishing a boulder, pausing occasionally to admire its own work, leaving marks that are both precise and whimsical. Even sand and small pebbles bear witness, carried by meltwater and deposited in new locations, forming patterns that guide future flows, wildlife paths, and plant growth. Lakes formed by glacial retreat shimmer in the distance, their edges irregular and sediment-laden, a mirror reflecting both sky and memory. The water's surface ripples gently in the breeze, yet beneath lies a chemical memory, nutrients, and traces from ice's slow movement, shaping life invisibly. Birds and mammals navigate the edges cautiously, following subtle cues embedded in vegetation, water clarity, and soil composition traces that the ice left behind, a legacy guiding survival long after its disappearance. Fjords, valleys, and moraines create a patchwork of influence across the landscape. You might imagine the terrain as a map, where every rock, groove, and sediment deposit is a letter or punctuation mark in the ongoing story of life's adaptation. Small creatures move along these paths, reading cues in subtle chemical shifts, moisture and shade, adjusting feeding, migration, and nesting accordingly. The Earth's memory acts as both guide and gentle conspirator, shaping behavior invisibly yet profoundly. Occasionally, a meltwater stream twists through a valley, carrying fresh sediment and nutrients. You notice how subtle shifts in color, texture, and temperature influence plant growth, insect populations, and the movement of larger animals. Each ripple, each trace, forms part of a continuous narrative, an intricate, patient, and subtly humorous orchestration of life responding to ancient ice. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama. Boulders perched improbably, valleys carved precisely, lakes shimmering with sediment and nutrients, and streams that follow paths dictated by forces long vanished. The Earth's memory is everywhere, visible in rock, soil, and water, invisible in chemical traces and subtle ecological cues. You feel intimately connected to this story, observing the quiet guidance left by ice, appreciating the delicate balance between memory, adaptation, and the profound absurdity of life following instructions from a frozen past. The ice may be gone, yet its influence persists, gently shaping every step you take, every plant that grows, and every river that flows. With more water circulating, currents shift, temperatures balance differently, ecosystems realign, life must readjust, oceans humming in new harmonies. Let's drift along the surface of one of these transformed oceans, feeling the subtle movement of water beneath your feet or boat, the faint, rhythmic pulse of currents that have quietly changed course. The air carries the scent of salt, minerals, and hints of nutrients freshly released from melting ice, a perfume both invigorating and strangely intimate. You notice how the sun glints across waves, casting fleeting rainbows and fractured reflections that hint at motion invisible to most observers. The ocean conveyor, a complex, global system of currents, has been subtly rewritten by additional freshwater input. Warm and cold currents now mingle in unfamiliar ways, redirecting nutrients, altering temperature gradients, and subtly reshaping marine ecosystems. Tiny plankton populations respond almost immediately, multiplying or shifting location, a microscopic pulse that echoes through the food chain. You might imagine them as tiny engineers, diligently managing energy and resources, oblivious to human observation, yet shaping entire oceans. The absurdity of these minuscule creatures directing such vast consequences is both humbling and amusing. Surface currents now sweep in new directions. Islands that once existed in relative isolation receive pulses of nutrient-rich water, stimulating coral growth, fish populations, and even the tiniest invertebrates. You notice the delicate interplay. Waves ripple across the surface, carrying plankton and detritus like messengers on invisible conveyor belts, delivering sustenance to remote, unexpected locations. Small schools of fish navigate these currents with precision, darting and weaving as though aware of the subtle engineering beneath them, orchestrating life in a choreography invisible yet deeply influential. Wind interacts with the ocean, stirring waves, creating turbulence, and mixing surface layers. You can feel the air brushing your cheeks, carrying faint aromas of kelp, salt, and wet rock. Occasionally, spray reaches your fingertips, tiny droplets carrying heat, minerals, and energy across the water. You might imagine the wind and ocean engaged in a playful competition, nudging currents here, stirring waves there, a conspiratorial duet that keeps life alert, responsive, and perpetually improvising. Temperature shifts ripple through deeper waters as well. Cold, nutrient-rich water sinks, mixing with warmer layers and generating new patterns of stratification. You notice how this subtly alters the behavior of creatures, from tiny plankton to large marine mammals. Whales, dolphins, and seals respond to prey distribution, adjusting migratory routes, hunting strategies, and social behavior. Even the smallest organisms follow chemical cues, moving in rhythm with the shifts, a quiet, complex, and sometimes absurd dance of adaptation dictated by currents and thermodynamics. Coastal ecosystems transform as well. Estuaries, mangroves, and wetlands respond to altered salinity and temperature, creating new habitats for fish, birds, and amphibians. You notice small crabs skittering along newly submerged mudflats, algae flourishing on newly exposed rocks, and bird colonies adjusting nesting sites to accommodate changing tides. The subtle interplay between ocean movement and terrestrial adaptation forms a narrative of quiet orchestration, a delicate balance of forces both visible and invisible. Deep ocean currents, previously isolated, now interact differently with nutrient flows, shifting plankton blooms and fish schools across vast distances. You notice how predators follow, subtly reorganizing ecosystems. The rhythm is precise yet playful. Schools of fish twist and turn. Predators circle in intricate patterns, and marine mammals glide through corridors of abundance created by the redistributed currents. You might chuckle at the absurdity of millions of creatures participating in a dance dictated by invisible, planetary-scale machinery. Icebergs and glacial melt continue to feed fresh water into these currents. Each drop contributes to chemical balances, salinity gradients, and subtle shifts in temperature, influencing circulation patterns. You notice waves lapping against floating ice, a gentle percussion reminding you of both permanence and impermanence, movement and stillness. Currents hum, literally, carrying energy across oceans, a slow, subtle song that sets the rhythm for life above and below the surface. Finally, as you step back or drift upward to observe the panorama, you see the ocean conveyor in full effect, currents weaving, nutrients flowing, ecosystems adjusting, and life responding with patience, precision, and occasional absurdity. The world beneath the waves is alive, humming with new harmonies, a testament to resilience, adaptation, and subtle humor. You feel intimately connected, witnessing the slow choreography of water, wind, and life, an orchestra of unseen forces, orchestrating survival, abundance, and the quiet poetry of an ocean reinvented. As ice pressure lifts, dormant volcanoes stir, magma flows, ash clouds rise, and new landforms are born. Fire and water dance, creating landscapes simultaneously hostile and magnificent. Let's step carefully onto the slopes of a waking volcano, feeling the subtle tremor beneath your boots, the low vibration of the earth, communicating an energy that has been building for millennia. The air carries a sharp, metallic scent, tinged with sulfur, hot stone, and the faint aroma of steam rising from fissures. Every inhalation reminds you that this landscape is alive, breathing, and subtly absurd in its unpredictable power. Lava slowly emerges from the earth, moving like a deliberate, molten river, glowing red-orange against dark, recently exposed rock. You might imagine it as a mischievous artist painting new landscapes, balancing beauty and destruction with a patient, almost comical precision. Steam hisses as molten rock meets melting ice or rainwater, sending delicate clouds of vapor into the sky, which drift lazily before dissipating. The contrast between fire and water is mesmerizing, a slow-motion ballet of elements dancing to rhythms far older than human observation. Ash clouds rise high into the sky, carrying fine dust across valleys, plains, and newly formed lakes. You notice how sunlight catches particles, creating a soft golden haze that transforms the landscape into a surreal, dreamlike panorama. Occasionally, small rocks tumble down slopes, clattering and bouncing like percussion instruments in a slow, improvised symphony. You might imagine a volcano chuckling quietly at the tiny humans, observing from a safe distance, amused by their awe and respect for forces that cannot be controlled. Streams of lava carve new channels across frozen or thawing terrain, interacting with ice, water, and soil in unpredictable ways. Where ice melts beneath the flow, small steam vents emerge, creating miniature geysers. You notice how vegetation nearby is temporarily scorched, only to eventually reclaim the land, a quiet reminder of resilience and the cyclical nature of destruction and rebirth. Even small insects, birds, and mammals adjust subtly, seeking shelter and opportunity amid changing landscapes, a tiny yet vital adaptation in response to planetary forces. The volcano's slopes are textured with layers of old lava, ash deposits, and glacial sediment, each telling a story of eruptions past. You might imagine walking across this terrain like reading an ancient manuscript written in stone, each line a chapter in the ongoing dialogue between ice, fire, and life. Tiny plants exploit cracks and fissures, mosses cling to warm rock, and insects find microhabitats where heat, moisture, and shelter converge. Life is both fragile and absurdly persistent, thriving where destruction and creation intermingle. Fires sparked by lava flows ignite small patches of vegetation, smoke curling upward in delicate spirals. You notice how the wind shapes these clouds, carrying scent, ash, and moisture across the landscape. Occasionally, a distant bird flaps through the haze, wings catching light as it navigates a landscape transformed by simultaneous fire and water. You might imagine the bird contemplating the absurdity of human curiosity, circling a glowing river of molten rock while remaining utterly practical in its own survival. Magma pools form near the volcano's vent, radiating heat that melts nearby ice and warms the air. You notice how the gradient of temperature shapes microclimates. Small pockets of life emerge. Plants grow faster in warm zones. Insects swarm near heated streams, and amphibians exploit the moisture and heat. The interplay of elements is precise yet playful, a reminder that the planet's creativity often carries humor and elegance in equal measure. Volcanic ash settles on distant lakes and rivers, enriching water with minerals that will feed plankton, fish, and amphibians. Tiny shifts in chemical composition ripple through aquatic ecosystems, connecting fire and water in ways both subtle and profound. You might imagine these interactions as an intricate dance, a conspiratorial collaboration between lava, ice, water, and life, choreographed over millennia, yet unfolding instantly before your eyes. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama. Glowing rivers of lava carving new valleys, ash clouds drifting over plains, steam rising from melting ice, and life cautiously reclaiming pockets of warmth. Fire and water move together, hostile yet magnificent, reshaping landscapes, influencing ecosystems, and demonstrating the quiet absurdity and brilliance of natural forces. You feel intimately connected, witnessing the ongoing dialogue between destruction and creation, a rhythm, patient, precise, and endlessly fascinating, a reminder that even dormant power, once awakened, reshapes the world in ways both terrifying and beautifully orchestrated. 23. Sediment stories. Every river carries tales from the mountains, every delta a chronicle of erosion and movement. Sediment becomes memory, slow and quiet, waiting to be read in distant futures. Let's step carefully along a riverbank, feeling the soft, shifting silt beneath your boots, each step leaving temporary impressions that the water will soon erase. The air smells faintly of wet stone, clay, and organic matter carried from upstream, a delicate combination of earth, water, and memory. You notice how the surface glints in sunlight, tiny particles sparkling like a constellation of stars fallen to the riverbed. Rivers gather sediment from mountains, cliffs, and eroded valleys, carrying stories of storms, glacial melt, and volcanic eruptions. Tiny grains of sand, mineral fragments, and organic matter float along, tracing paths that will shape deltas and floodplains far downstream. You might imagine each particle as a messenger, silently conveying information across kilometers, reaching shores and habitats that will benefit from its arrival centuries later. The absurd poetry of this slow communication, invisible, silent, yet profoundly impactful, is impossible not to marvel at. Along the river, you notice small eddies swirling sediment in delicate spirals. Each swirl captures a moment, a frozen miniature narrative of movement energy, and balance. Leaves, twigs, and pebbles become part of this sedimentary story, carried downstream in an invisible choreography dictated by water, slope, and gravity. You might imagine a pebble pausing mid-journey, reflecting, "Where will I end up? What stories will I tell?" The humor of imagining inanimate objects pondering their fate is subtle but comforting, a conspiratorial wink from nature to attentive observers. Deltas form where rivers meet oceans or lakes, their sediments spreading across shallow waters to create fertile soil. You notice the intricate layering: fine silt, coarse sand, organic debris, each layer preserving a subtle memory of events long past. Floods, ice melts, volcanic eruptions. Tiny aquatic organisms, from plankton to small fish, exploit these nutrient-rich zones, creating a microcosm of life that thrives on the river's storytelling. Birds skim over the water, catching fish that trace their own paths along these nutrient highways. The colors of sediment vary widely, creating a natural mosaic. Ochres, rusts, greens and greys mix in patterns dictated by water flow, geology, and climate. You might imagine the river as an abstract painter, each grain of sediment a brushstroke contributing to a slow-motion masterpiece, visible only to those patient enough to observe. Occasionally, a boulder or log disrupts the flow, creating localized eddies and pockets where sediment collects differently, a reminder that even small obstacles can redirect the course of memory. Sediment records chemical traces as well. Minerals, nutrients, and even tiny pollutants are captured along the journey, influencing downstream ecosystems. You notice subtle shifts in water color, where sediment concentrations change, signaling the presence of iron, phosphorus, or other elements. These invisible signatures guide plant growth, fish spawning, and microbial activity, a quiet but profound orchestration of life. You might imagine the river as a librarian, cataloging events and distributing information to anyone who is attentive enough to read its pages. Floodplains expand as rivers overflow, depositing fresh layers of sediment across the land. Plants germinate, birds nest, and insects thrive on these fertile banks. You notice how each flood leaves a subtle signature: raised ridges, small depressions, and lines that will guide future water flow. Even mammals respond. Deer and foxes follow new paths, adjusting their movements to the microtopography created by sediment deposition. The rhythm of adaptation mirrors the river itself, patient, deliberate, and occasionally delightfully absurd. Over millennia, sediment builds deltas that support forests, wetlands, and coastal ecosystems. You notice tiny details: leaves caught in silt, twigs aligned by current, shells resting like punctuation marks along the river's edge. Each layer is a historical record, a quiet memoir written in earth and water. You might chuckle at the idea of rivers keeping diaries, their pages, invisible yet enduring, shaping life long after the author has moved on. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama: rivers winding through valleys, deltas stretching into seas, floodplains nourished by centuries of sediment, and ecosystems responding to the invisible stories carried downstream. Sediment, once frozen in ice, now writes a narrative in mud, sand, and nutrient-rich soil, a testament to memory, persistence, and subtle humor. You feel intimately connected, witnessing the Earth's slow narration, the quiet poetry of rivers as chroniclers of time, life, and movement. The stories flow onward, waiting to be read, interpreted, and experienced by all who care to notice. Every river carries tales from the mountains, every delta a chronicle of erosion and movement. Sediment becomes memory, slow and quiet, waiting to be read in distant futures. Let's step carefully along a riverbank, feeling the soft, shifting silt beneath your boots, each step leaving temporary impressions that the water will soon erase. The air smells faintly of wet stone, clay, and organic matter carried from upstream, a delicate combination of earth, water, and memory. You notice how the surface glints in sunlight, tiny particles sparkling like a constellation of stars fallen to the riverbed. Rivers gather sediment from mountains, cliffs, and eroded valleys, carrying stories of storms, glacial melt, and volcanic eruptions. Tiny grains of sand, mineral fragments, and organic matter float along, tracing paths that will shape deltas and floodplains far downstream. You might imagine each particle as a messenger, silently conveying information across kilometers, reaching shores and habitats that will benefit from its arrival centuries later. The absurd poetry of this slow communication, invisible, silent, yet profoundly impactful, is impossible not to marvel at. Along the river, you notice small eddies swirling sediment in delicate spirals. Each swirl captures a moment, a frozen miniature narrative of movement, energy, and balance. Leaves, twigs, and pebbles become part of this sedimentary story, carried downstream in an invisible choreography dictated by water, slope, and gravity. You might imagine a pebble pausing mid-journey, reflecting, where will I end up? What stories will I tell? The humor of imagining inanimate objects pondering their fate is subtle but comforting, a conspiratorial wink from nature to attentive observers. Deltas form where rivers meet oceans or lakes, their sediments spreading across shallow waters to create fertile soil. You notice the intricate layering, fine silt, coarse sand, organic debris, each layer preserving a subtle memory of events long past: floods, ice melts, volcanic eruptions. Tiny aquatic organisms, from plankton to small fish, exploit these nutrient-rich zones, creating a microcosm of life that thrives on the river's storytelling. Birds skim over the water, catching fish that trace their own paths along these nutrient highways. The colors of sediment vary widely, creating a natural mosaic. Ochres, rusts, greens, and grays mix in patterns dictated by water flow, geology, and climate. You might imagine the river as an abstract painter, each grain of sediment a brushstroke contributing to a slow-motion masterpiece, visible only to those patient enough to observe. Occasionally, a boulder or log disrupts the flow, creating localized eddies and pockets where sediment collects differently, a reminder that even small obstacles can redirect the course of memory. Sediment records chemical traces as well. Minerals, nutrients, and even tiny pollutants are captured along the journey, influencing downstream ecosystems. You notice subtle shifts in water color, where sediment concentrations change, signaling the presence of iron, phosphorus, or other elements. These invisible signatures guide plant growth, fish spawning, and microbial activity, a quiet but profound orchestration of life. You might imagine the river as a librarian, cataloging events and distributing information to anyone who is attentive enough to read its pages. Floodplains expand as rivers overflow, depositing fresh layers of sediment across the land. Plants germinate, birds nest, and insects thrive on these fertile banks. You notice how each flood leaves a subtle signature: raised ridges, small depressions, and lines that will guide future water flow. Even mammals respond. Deer and foxes follow new paths, adjusting their movements to the microtopography created by sediment deposition. The rhythm of adaptation mirrors the river itself, patient, deliberate, and occasionally delightfully absurd. Over millennia, sediment builds deltas that support forests, wetlands, and coastal ecosystems. You notice tiny details: leaves caught in silt, twigs aligned by current, shells resting like punctuation marks along the river's edge. Each layer is a historical record, a quiet memoir written in earth and water. You might chuckle at the idea of rivers keeping diaries, their pages invisible yet enduring, shaping life long after the author has moved on. Finally, stepping back, you take in the panorama: rivers winding through valleys, deltas stretching into seas, floodplains nourished by centuries of sediment, and ecosystems responding to the invisible stories carried downstream. Sediment, once frozen in ice, now writes a narrative in mud, sand, and nutrient-rich soil, a testament to memory, persistence, and subtle humor. You feel intimately connected, witnessing the earth's slow narration, the quiet poetry of rivers, as chroniclers of time, life, and movement. The stories flow onward, waiting to be read, interpreted, and experienced by all who care to notice. Some species cling to hidden sanctuaries, caves, mountaintops, or deep forests. These refuges become cradles for evolution, shaping future generations in isolation. Let's move quietly along the edge of one of these refuges, noticing how the terrain provides protection, resources, and subtle guidance to those who seek it. The air is heavy with the scent of damp stone, decaying leaves, and earthy minerals, a perfume that speaks of safety, persistence, and life sustained through adversity. You notice the interplay of shadow and light as trees, rocks, and ice remnants shape microclimates, each offering a unique opportunity for survival. In caves, small animals shelter from predators and harsh weather, their breaths creating tiny clouds of moisture that cling to walls. You might imagine them exchanging silent gossip, squeaks and clicks, forming a private conversation that humans can only interpret as mystery. Stalactites drip slowly, each drop carving miniature paths over centuries, a patient artist shaping the hidden interior of the earth. The sound of dripping water resonates in the silence, punctuating the lives of creatures that depend on this haven. Even fungi, mosses, and microbes exploit these hidden spaces, contributing to a miniature ecosystem, invisible to the casual observer, but rich in interconnections. Mountaintops serve as refuges for birds, insects, and small mammals. You notice how species adapt to thinner air, colder temperatures, and rugged terrain, developing specialized behaviors and physiologies. The wind carries scents, seeds, and even tiny flying insects, connecting isolated habitats in subtle ways. You might imagine a small mountain goat pausing mid-step, surveying the valley below as if pondering which hidden path offers the least risk and the most opportunity, a quiet absurdity in its careful calculations. These mountaintop sanctuaries create evolutionary pressure, leading to adaptations that will ripple into future generations. Deep forests are another refuge, dense canopies shielding species from the extremes of climate and predators. Sunlight filters in scattered beams, highlighting patches of moss, ferns, and undergrowth where small animals forage, nest, or hide. You notice the delicate balance. Fallen branches provide cover, tree hollows offer shelter, and leaf litter conceals insects and amphibians. Even large predators navigate cautiously, respecting the constraints of space and vegetation. You might imagine them silently tiptoeing through the forest, performing an invisible choreography that blends caution, patience, and subtle humor. Isolation fosters evolution. Populations separated by terrain, climate, or water adapt uniquely, developing traits that might not appear elsewhere. Tiny fish in secluded streams grow specialized features to navigate specific currents, while birds in mountaintop refuges may evolve unique plumage or songs. You notice the beauty of this hidden diversity, subtle differences that reflect centuries of careful adaptation, a quiet, patient innovation that is both logical and absurdly creative. The planet seems to wink, leaving hidden laboratories where life experiments on itself, slowly, deliberately, and sometimes humorously. Caves and underground rivers harbor amphibians and insects, species that thrive on darkness, moisture, and stable conditions. You notice how even in this quiet isolation, small competitions, predation, and reproduction occur, shaping communities in ways invisible yet profound. You might imagine an underground beetle pausing at the edge of a pool, contemplating whether to cross a current or wait, a tiny, absurd drama that echoes the grand story of survival across scales. Every crevice, every drop of water, every mineral-encrusted wall plays a role in sustaining life. Refuges near rivers, lakes, and wetlands offer temporary safety as well. Birds and mammals utilize elevated banks, tree islands, or dense vegetation to avoid rising water or predators. Seeds disperse along water, establishing new life in safe niches. You notice the interplay of water, soil, and sunlight, creating microhabitats that are both fragile and resilient. You might chuckle at the absurdity of a tiny bird treating a fallen branch as a runway, balancing life and opportunity with grace and subtle humor. Finally, stepping back, you observe a panorama of hidden sanctuaries, caves shimmering with moisture, mountaintops crowned with snow and vegetation, and deep forests alive with unseen motion. Life persists, protected, evolving, and adapting in isolation. You feel intimately connected, witnessing the patient creativity of evolution at work, the subtle humor and ingenuity of species finding refuge amid chaos, and the enduring poetry of survival in secret corners of the earth. These refuges are more than shelters. They are laboratories, archives, and theaters of life, quietly shaping the future, one generation at a time. Finally, picture a planet remade, coastlines redrawn, mountains softened, ecosystems transformed. Humanity watches, adapts, and survives. Ice may be gone, but its story lingers in every river, valley, and breath of wind. Let's wander slowly across this remade landscape, feeling the gentle undulations of land that was once compressed beneath ice, noting the soft soil, fertile floodplains, and streams that now guide life with quiet persistence. The air is alive with a mixture of scents, fresh water, wet earth, flowering plants, and distant forests, reclaiming former tundra, a perfume of renewal and memory. Mountains, once sharp and jagged under the weight of glaciers, now rise in softer contours, valleys carved by meltwater and sediment. You notice the way sunlight plays across ridges and slopes, casting shadows that stretch lazily across plains, highlighting patterns in rock and vegetation. Rivers meander freely, carrying minerals and nutrients from distant highlands to fertile lowlands, shaping ecosystems that are vibrant, dynamic, and subtly humorous in their complexity. Fish glide along these waterways, insects hover near edges, and birds circle overhead, adapting instinctively to conditions that are both familiar and astonishingly new. Coastlines have shifted dramatically. Islands appear where water has filled old valleys, peninsulas stretch where sediment has accumulated, and estuaries form intricate networks. You might imagine the absurd poetry of a city once at sea level, now perched above a fertile river delta, its inhabitants rowing through streets that were formerly avenues, navigating the new geography with a mixture of grace, ingenuity, and quiet humor. Waves lap at shores in rhythmic patterns, occasionally carrying debris, driftwood, or seeds. each item contributing to a subtle, ongoing transformation of the land. Forests flourish where ice once reigned. Trees of varying species push upward in newly fertile soil, their roots stabilizing slopes and riverbanks. You notice mosses and lichens thriving on rocks and fallen logs, tiny ecosystems within ecosystems. Birds call through canopies, insects buzz from flower to flower, and mammals move carefully across soft ground, all responding to opportunities shaped by the retreat of ice. The contrast between colossal natural forces and delicate life is profoundly humbling, a reminder that adaptation and resilience coexist in perfect, sometimes absurd balance. Humanity thrives in harmony with these changes. Settlements adapt to shifting terrain, constructing homes on higher ground, along rivers, and on islands formed by sediment deposition. Agriculture has moved inland, fishing practices adjust to new waterways, and transport relies on both land and water. You might imagine a farmer navigating flooded terraces, a fisherman steering a boat through a newly formed delta, each step a small dance in sync with the planet's rhythm. The subtle humor of humans adjusting, improvising, and thriving amid immense changes is quietly delightful, evidence of our species' enduring creativity. Rivers and lakes act as both guides and archives. You notice the chemical traces of ancient ice, nutrient flows, and sediment layers, all influencing plant growth, aquatic life, and wildlife migration. Tiny organisms exploit microhabitats, while larger animals track seasonal shifts in vegetation, water, and prey availability. Every ripple, every current, every gently flowing stream carries information about the past, shaping present behavior and future development. You might chuckle at the thought of a fish navigating a river that remembers glaciers long gone, silently following instructions written by ice itself. Wind patterns adjust to new topographies and coastlines. Breezes carry seeds, pollen, and moisture inland, distributing life with subtle precision. You notice how clouds form differently, storms arrive in altered rhythms, and microclimates emerge, each creating opportunities for survival and adaptation. Birds, insects, and even humans use these signals instinctively, moving with the subtle guidance of atmosphere, land, and water in a collaboration that is both pragmatic and quietly absurd. Finally, stepping back to take in the full panorama, you see a planet renewed, rivers carving fertile valleys, mountains softened and sculpted by ancient ice, forests sprawling into former tundra, and coastlines redrawn by water and sediment. Humanity persists, thriving and adapting, quietly integrated into this dynamic balance of life. The echoes of ice linger everywhere, in the patterns of valleys, in nutrient-rich soils, in sediment-laden rivers, and in the rhythm of wind and water. You feel intimately connected, observing not just survival, but the subtle poetry of a planet remade, shaped by forces that are patient, persistent, and occasionally mischievous. The story of ice may be gone in form, yet its influence persists in every ecosystem, every breath of wind, and every current that moves across the planet. Mountains, rivers, forests, and oceans all carry traces of what was, whispering reminders of resilience, adaptation, and the slow, intricate dance of life, responding to forces far beyond any single lifespan. You realize that change is constant, evolution inevitable, and yet, amid it all, life, human, animal, and plant alike, finds ways to persist, innovate, and even find humor in its own endurance.